Consider for a moment the most valuable substance in human history. Not gold, which merely adorns, not oil, which merely powers, but something that enables consciousness itself to transcend the boundaries of space and time. In the year 10,191 of the imperial calendar, humanity had spread across 1,000,000 worlds, yet its entire civilization balanced upon a single product from a single planet. This is the story of how that impossible dependency shaped the fate of our species. The spice mélange. Even the name carries a poetic irony, a French word meaning mixture, describing something that exists nowhere else in the known universe. On every world where humans have settled, in every laboratory where the brightest minds have labored, no one has ever successfully synthesized it. It appears in only one place, the deep deserts of Arrakis, a planet so harsh that its very existence seems an insult to the possibility of life. Imagine a substance that does three things simultaneously, each one alone worth planetary fortunes. First, it extends human life not merely by years, but by centuries. The elderly do not simply endure, they thrive, their minds sharp, their bodies resilient. Second, it expands consciousness, opening neural pathways that allow certain trained minds to perceive futures that have not yet occurred, to navigate the intricate web of causality that others experience as mere chance. Third, and most critically for our scattered species, it enables the Spacing Guild navigators to fold space itself. Picture the void between stars. Light, traveling at its cosmic speed limit, takes years to traverse the distances between human worlds. Without the spice, without the prescient navigation it enables, humanity would be trapped in slow ships, each journey a multi-generational odyssey from which travelers would never return home. The Spacing Guild changed everything. Their navigators, transformed by massive spice consumption into something barely human, perceive the pathways through folded space. They see the safe routes through dimensions we cannot comprehend. They make interstellar commerce possible. They make the Imperium possible. And they depend absolutely on Arrakis. This dependency created a leverage point unlike any in human history. The Spacing Guild could not function without spice. The Guild could not function. Interstellar travel would cease. Without interstellar travel, the Imperium would fragment into isolated worlds, each one alone in the darkness, cut off from the great currents of commerce and culture that define civilization. The Emperor himself, for all his Sardaukar legions and ancient authority, could not survive 3 months without spice flowing from Arrakis to the Guild. His power rested not on his throne on Kaitain, but on the continued operation of spice harvesters on a desert world he did not directly control. This is the architecture of an empire, not built on force alone, but on force, economic flows so vital that disrupting them means collapse. The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV understood this perfectly. He was not, despite what his enemies claimed, a weak man. He was a man trapped by the very system that elevated him to supreme authority. His father and grandfather before him had learned the crucial lesson. The emperor does not rule the Imperium through absolute power, but through careful balance between the great houses. Too much favor to one house threatens the others. Too much suppression creates unity among potential rebels. The emperor's role was to maintain equilibrium, to prevent any single house from accumulating enough power to challenge the throne. For 10,000 years, this system had functioned with remarkable stability. The great houses of the Landsraad, each controlling multiple worlds, competed endlessly for commercial advantage, political influence, and social prestige. They fought their wars through assassins rather than armies, through economic pressure rather than open conflict, because the emperor and the guild enforced a delicate peace. The guild would not transport military forces for wars of conquest. The Emperor's Sardaukar troops, the most feared fighters in the known universe, waited in reserve to crush any house that broke the conventions of limited warfare. Yet beneath this apparent stability, immense fortunes rose and fell based on a single commodity from a single world: Arrakis, the Dune planet, a place of such hostile beauty that those who have seen it never forget. Imagine a world where water is so scarce that a man's body moisture represents measurable wealth, where the air itself seems to extract every drop of liquid from exposed skin, where the only bodies of water are held in underground reservoirs, guarded and rationed with religious fervour, where the morning dew, if it comes at all, is treated as a miracle. This world, by all rational assessment, should have been abandoned, left to its ecology of sand and stone. Instead, it became the most strategically important location in the known universe. Because deep in its deserts, in the sand that stretched beyond the horizon, the spice melange grew, not in gardens or fields, but in spice blows, eruptions from deep beneath the surface, where the life cycle of sandworms and sand plankton created the chemical miracle that powered an empire. The Chome Company, the Combine Honete Ober-Advancer Mercantiles, controlled the spice trade and bound the great houses together through economic interest. Every house held shares in Chome. Every house therefore had a stake in the continued flow of spice from Arrakis. The Harkonnens held the quasi-fief on Arrakis for 80 years, and during that time they extracted profits so vast that the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen became one of the wealthiest individuals in the Imperium. The spice enriched Chome shareholders. The spice enriched the Emperor through his overwhelming share in Chome. The spice enriched the Spacing Guild through their monopoly on interstellar transport. Everyone prospered from Arrakis except the planet's native population. The Fremen, desert people who had adapted to Arrakis not through technology alone, but through culture, physiology, and fierce discipline. They lived in cave systems called sieches, hidden deep in the desert where Harkonnen satellites could not track them. They wore still suits, remarkable garments that captured body moisture and recirculated it, allowing survival in conditions that would kill an off-worlder within hours. They knew the desert as sailors know the sea, reading its moods, respecting its dangers, harvesting its resources. The Imperium's intelligence services counted perhaps 10,000 Fremen scattered across the wasteland, an insignificant population, dismissed as primitive desert dwellers who posed no threat to spice operations. They occasionally raided spice harvesters, stealing equipment and water supplies, but these were nuisances, not strategic concerns. The Harkonnens maintained military forces to suppress Fremen resistance, but devoted most of their attention to maximizing spice production and crushing any threats from rival houses. This was the Imperium's first great intelligence failure. The Fremen numbered not in thousands, but in millions. They had concealed their true population for centuries, understanding that to reveal their strength would invite annihilation. They possessed something that no other fighting force in the Imperium could claim: perfect adaptation to the most hostile environment humans had ever inhabited. Every Fremen child learned to move in the desert without creating rhythms that would attract sandworms. Every adult could survive on moisture that would leave a trained soldier dead from dehydration. Every warrior fought with a ferocity born from a culture where water was life, where every drop of moisture in an enemy's body represented tangible wealth. The Imperium did not see them because the Imperium had never learned to look properly. This blindness extended beyond mere population statistics. The great houses and their intelligence networks failed to understand what the desert had created. They saw Arrakis as a resource extraction problem, how to harvest maximum spice at minimum cost. They calculated in terms of equipment efficiency, worker productivity, and shipping schedules. What they failed to calculate was that the harsh environment that made spice production so difficult had also forged a population into something extraordinary. Consider the logic that governs harsh places. On gentle worlds, humans grow soft. Resources are abundant, technology cushions every hardship, and survival requires little more than participation in the economic system. But on Arrakis, survival demands constant vigilance, absolute discipline, and skills honed from childhood. The Fremen did not simply live on Arrakis, they had become desert creatures, as adapted to sand as the sandworms themselves. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen understood Arrakis better than most, but even his understanding had limits. He recognized that Arrakis was the ultimate strategic prize. Control the spice, and you control the lever that moves the Imperium. He had spent 80 years developing the infrastructure of extraction, building relationships with the Guild and the Emperor, positioning himself as indispensable to the spice flow. His intelligence networks tracked rivals. His economic calculations maximized profit while maintaining just enough spice production to keep the Guild satisfied. His military preparations, disguised as necessary security for spice operations, had created a formidable force capable of striking anywhere in the Imperium. But the Baron, for all his cunning, made the same mistake as every other power broker. He saw Arrakis as a chess piece to be played in the greater game of imperial politics. He failed to understand that Arrakis itself was a player, that the desert and its people represented a force that existed outside the careful calculations of the great houses. The system that governed the Imperium appeared stable. The Emperor balanced the great houses. The Guild maintained the peace through their transportation monopoly. Chome distributed profits to keep everyone invested in the status quo. The spice flowed, fortunes accumulated, and the machinery of an interstellar civilization hummed along with seemingly eternal momentum. Yet within this apparent stability, tensions accumulated like pressure beneath the desert floor. The Emperor's power rested on the loyalty of houses who constantly maneuvered for advantage. The Guild's monopoly depended on a single planet that could be disrupted by natural disaster or deliberate sabotage. The Chome prophets assumed continued exploitation of Arrakis without significant resistance. The entire structure balanced on assumptions that had never been properly tested. What happens when a system built on universal dependency encounters a force that exists outside its logic? What occurs when a civilization that has arranged itself around the controlled flow of a substance suddenly faces the possibility of that flow being interrupted? These questions existed as theoretical concerns, discussed in strategy sessions and war games, but never seriously confronted. The Imperium had grown complacent. 10,000 years of stability had created the illusion of permanence. The great houses played their games of assassination and economic warfare, but always within understood boundaries. The rules were clear, the limits accepted, the consequences predictable. No one sought to overturn the system entirely, because everyone benefited from its continuation. This was the second great intelligence failure. The assumption that because the system had endured for millennia, it would endure indefinitely. In the year 10,191, the Imperium functioned exactly as it had for generations. Spice harvesters worked the deep desert, Guild navigators folded space, Chome shareholders collected dividends. The Emperor maintained his balance between the houses. The Fremen hid in their sieges and were forgotten by those who profited from their planet. But systems in perfect balance are also systems of maximum potential energy. Change a single variable, introduce a single unpredicted element, and everything transforms. The science of chaos teaches us that complex systems with many interdependent parts can shift from stability to catastrophe with surprising speed. The equilibrium that seems so permanent proves to be a temporary arrangement held together by circumstances that may not endure. The Imperium was about to discover this truth in the most devastating way possible. Imagine standing at the edge of an ocean before a tsunami strikes. The water seems calm, perhaps even withdrawing from the shore in an unusual way that draws attention. Everything appears normal until the moment it isn't, and then the wave arrives with unstoppable force, reshaping the coastline in minutes. The destruction that follows does not announce itself with warnings. It simply happens, and those who fail to read the signs correctly are swept away. The foundation of the Imperium's power, the spice monopoly, the careful balance between houses, the guild's transportation network, the Emperor's ancient authority, all of it rested on assumptions that would soon be tested. The system had endured for so long that its architects had forgotten it was a human creation, subject to human ambitions, vulnerable to human mistakes. In the deep desert, where no satellite could penetrate and no Harkonnen patrol could venture safely, the Fremen watched and waited. They had their own prophecy, their own vision of what Arrakis might become. They spoke of the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, who would lead them to paradise. They dreamed of a green Arrakis, of water flowing freely, of life transforming death. These dreams seemed as impossible as the planet itself, yet the Fremen held them with the same fierce discipline that let them survive in the wasteland. They were patient, they understood, in ways the Imperium did not, that the desert teaches you to wait for the right moment, to conserve your strength, to strike only when conditions favor survival. The moment was approaching, though no one recognized it yet. All the elements were in position. The Emperor's fear of rising rivals, the Baron's ambition for greater control, the Guild's absolute dependency on spice, the Fremen's hidden strength, and soon a young man whose genetic heritage and training would allow him to see the branching pathways of possible futures. The Imperium of 10,191 believed it had achieved a permanent stability, a balance that would endure for 10,000 years more. It had built its prosperity on the extraction of a resource from a desert world, assuming that the desert and its people posed no threat to arrangements made in distant palaces and boardrooms. This assumption would not survive what came next. The spice monopoly had made Arrakis the galaxy's pivot point. Control of Arrakis meant control of the lever that could move the entire Imperium. The great houses understood this intellectually, but had never confronted what it meant practically. They had never considered that the lever might be seized by someone willing to use it without restraint, someone who could see the consequences of his actions branching across futures and chose the terrible path anyway. The foundation had been laid across centuries of exploitation and blindness. The pieces had moved into position through the ambitious calculations of men who believed themselves masters of strategy. The stage was set for a transformation that would reshape human civilization across 1,000,000 worlds. And in the deep desert, the sandworms moved beneath the surface, their immense bodies gliding through sand like water, patient and ancient, waiting as they had waited for millennia, unaware that they would soon carry on their backs the weight of humanity's future. There are men who pursue wealth for comfort, for status, for the pleasures it affords. And then there are men who understand that wealth, accumulated with sufficient ruthlessness and vision, becomes something else entirely, power in its most fungible form. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen belonged to this second category, and for 80 years he had transformed Arrakis from a mere fief into a machine of such exquisite efficiency that it generated profits beyond the dreams of most planetary governors. The Baron did not merely exploit Arrakis, he understood it as a complete system, geological, economic, political, and human. Every element could be optimized, every inefficiency eliminated, every opportunity for extraction maximized. This was not the crude pillaging of a conqueror, but the calculated management of a vast enterprise where every decision cascaded through layers of consequence, each one amplifying profit or reducing cost. Consider his approach to labor. The Imperium maintained certain conventions about worker treatment, rules designed to prevent the most obvious forms of abuse. The Baron understood that these rules existed not from moral principle, but from pragmatic calculation. If workers died too quickly, replacement costs rose. He found the precise equilibrium point where human suffering remained just below the threshold that would trigger imperial intervention, but just above the level that would allow workers any margin of safety or dignity. The spice harvesters operated in the deep desert, where temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Workers labored in these conditions for 12-hour shifts, their bodies losing moisture at rates that would kill an unprotected person within hours. The Baron provided the minimum water rations necessary for survival, calculated down to the milliliter. Deaths occurred, certainly, but always within statistically acceptable ranges. When imperial inspectors arrived, which happened rarely, given the Baron's careful cultivation of the right officials, the facilities passed inspection. The brutality was invisible to those who did not look closely, hidden in mortality statistics that could be explained as the natural hazards of working on Arrakis. This was the genius of his cruelty. It masqueraded as operational necessity. The profits from spice extraction flowed into multiple channels, each one carefully structured to maximize return while minimizing visibility. The official accounting reported to CHOAM showed respectable margins, good, but not extraordinary. The real profits moved through shell companies, hidden accounts, and arrangements so complex that even dedicated auditors could not trace them fully. The Baron skimmed from the spice quota, underreporting production and selling the excess on the black market at multiples of the official price. He charged back every conceivable expense to CHOAM while pocketing efficiencies. He created artificial scarcities that drove up prices, then profited from the solutions to problems he had engineered. Over 80 years, these hidden streams of wealth had made him one of the richest individuals in the known universe. But the Baron understood something that lesser men did not. Money alone was merely paper, numbers in accounts. True power came from deploying that wealth to create dependencies, to purchase loyalty, to build networks that would serve your interests without constant supervision. He had spent decades weaving a web of corruption that bound key officials throughout the Imperium to Harkonnen interests, not through crude bribery that was too obvious, too vulnerable to exposure, but through sophisticated arrangements where everyone believed they were acting in their own interest. A guild navigator's family received investment, opportunities that generated extraordinary returns. An imperial auditor found his children accepted into the most prestigious schools. A CHOAM director discovered that his unprofitable ventures mysteriously became successful when Harkonnen interests were involved. Each person in this network had their own rational justification for cooperation. Each one could tell themselves they were simply accepting good fortune, not selling their integrity. Yet together, they formed a structure that served the Baron's purposes with remarkable efficiency. When he needed a report delayed, it was delayed. When he needed an inspection to overlook certain details, it overlooked them. When he needed information about rival houses, it appeared on his desk. This was power at its most refined, not the obvious domination of physical force, but the invisible guidance of self-interest aligned to serve a single vision. The Baron's relationship with the Emperor represented his greatest achievement in strategic positioning. Shaddam IV needed the spice to flow, needed the profits from his CHOAM shares, needed the guild satisfied. The Baron ensured all these needs were met, but always with the implicit message that his management was indispensable. He cultivated the impression that Arrakis was extraordinarily difficult to govern, that the Fremen posed constant threats, that only Harkonnen expertise and ruthlessness kept the spice flowing at current levels. He made himself seem irreplaceable, while making the fief seem poisonous to any successor. At the same time, he built military capabilities that far exceeded what would normally be permitted for spice extraction security. The Harkonnen troops numbered in the tens of thousands, equipped with advanced weaponry and trained in tactics that had nothing to do with controlling desert tribes. The Baron justified this force as necessary for protecting spice operations from Fremen raids, but his true purpose was transparent to anyone who looked carefully. He was building an army capable of projecting power far beyond Arrakis. The Emperor knew this. The Guild knew this. The great houses knew this. Yet no one moved against him, because disrupting Harkonnen control of Arrakis meant disrupting the spice supply, and no one was willing to risk that consequence. The Baron had achieved the ultimate strategic position too valuable to eliminate, too dangerous to ignore, positioned at the exact point where everyone's interests intersected. His intelligence operations represented perhaps his most sophisticated achievement. The Baron understood that information, properly gathered and analyzed, provided leverage equal to military force. He maintained agents throughout the Landsraad, not the crude spies of popular imagination, but people embedded so deeply in their cover roles that even they sometimes forgot who they truly served. These operatives reported not just on military preparations or political negotiations, but on psychology, on relationships, on the subtle indicators that revealed true intentions beneath official statements. The Baron studied his rivals with the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens. He knew which houses were financially vulnerable, which leaders had exploitable weaknesses, which alliances were genuine versus convenient. He collected secrets not to use them immediately, but to hold them in reserve, weapons to be deployed at the precise moment when they would achieve maximum effect. A threat whispered at the right time could achieve what an army could not. A weakness exploited with surgical precision could topple arrangements that appeared stable. Duke Leto Atreides particularly fascinated the Baron. Here was everything Harkonnen was not honorable, beloved by his people, admired throughout the Landsraad for his fairness and integrity. The Duke's growing influence represented a direct challenge to the careful balance the Baron had cultivated. Leto had no interest in overt power, grabs, which made him more dangerous, not less. His example threatened the entire structure of corruption and ruthlessness that the Baron had normalized. The Baron began studying the Atreides house with obsessive attention. He learned of Leto's strengths, the loyalty of his troops, the efficiency of his administration, the respect he commanded from other houses. More importantly, he identified Leto's weaknesses, a tendency toward honor that could become predictable, relationships that created exploitable dependencies, and a trust in certain individuals that might be misplaced. Dr. Wellington Yue, the Atreides physician, particularly interested Baron Harkonnen's analysts. A Suk doctor, conditioned against taking human life, appeared invulnerable to the usual forms of coercion. But the Baron's intelligence operatives had discovered something. Yue's wife had been captured by the Harkonnen. She was held in conditions of such sophisticated torment that the doctor would do anything to end her suffering, even if that meant betraying his conditioning. This was the Baron's approach to problem-solving, distilled to its essence. Identify the unbreakable, find its breaking point, apply pressure until it shatters. Yet even as he built these capabilities and deepened these networks, the Baron faced a fundamental limitation. The Emperor would never permit him to hold Arrakis indefinitely. The quasi-fief arrangement was temporary by design, meant to prevent any house from establishing permanent control over the spice supply. The Baron knew that eventually the Emperor would transfer Arrakis to another house, likely one of the great houses whose loyalty Shaddam wished to secure or whose growing power he wished to check. This knowledge shaped the Baron's long-term strategy. He could not hold Arrakis forever, so he prepared to make its loss temporary. He deliberately mismanaged certain aspects of the operation, while appearing to maximize efficiency. He created documentation showing that spice production was declining due to natural factors rather than policy choices. He exaggerated the Fremen threat, suggesting that only brutal suppression kept them from disrupting operations entirely. He built the narrative that Arrakis was becoming increasingly difficult to govern, that whoever took over would face mounting challenges. Most importantly, he prepared for recapture. The Baron maintained hidden assets on Arrakis weapons caches, loyal operatives, sleeper agents who would appear to serve the new regime while actually reporting to Giedi Prime. He studied the probable successor houses, identifying which ones the Emperor might choose and preparing specific strategies for each scenario. He cultivated relationships with the Spacing Guild that would allow rapid military transport when the moment came to strike. The plan was elegant in its ruthlessness. Let a rival house take Arrakis, let them struggle with the mounting difficulties he had engineered, then crush them and reclaim the fief with the Emperor's blessing. The rival house's failure would justify Harkonnen's return, and the interregnum would allow the Baron to negotiate better terms for the restored arrangement. This strategy required patience and precise calculation. The Baron needed the successor house to fail visibly, but not catastrophically. A complete collapse of spice production would bring imperial intervention and possibly direct governance, which would eliminate any chance of Harkonnen return. The successor needed to demonstrate enough incompetence to justify replacement, but not so much as to trigger emergency measures. The balance was delicate, the timeline uncertain. For years, the Baron watched and waited, building his capabilities, deepening his networks, positioning himself for the moment when the Emperor would announce the transfer of the Arrakis quasi-fief to new management. Consider the mind that could conceive and execute such a strategy. The Baron operated on timescales that most humans could not sustain. He thought not in seasons or years, but in decades, willing to accept temporary setbacks as investments in larger victories. He viewed human beings not as individuals with inherent worth, but as resources to be deployed, obstacles to be removed, or tools to be used until they broke. His cruelty was not passionate but calculated, applied with the precision of a surgeon making necessary cuts. Yet beneath this cold rationality existed something else, an appetite for domination that went beyond mere strategic calculation. The Baron did not simply want wealth or power. He wanted to prove himself superior to the constraints that limited lesser men. He wanted to demonstrate that someone willing to be sufficiently ruthless could reshape the Imperium according to his vision. Arrakis was not just a source of profit. It was validation of his philosophy that the strong should take what they desired and crush anyone foolish enough to resist. This combination of strategic brilliance and psychological need made him extraordinarily dangerous. A merely greedy man could be satisfied. A merely ambitious man could be redirected. But the Baron required constant conquest, constant proof of his superiority, constant validation through the suffering of those he dominated. His nephew, Fade Rautha, represented the Baron's attempt to extend this philosophy beyond his own lifetime. The young man was being groomed not merely as an heir but as a perfected version of Harkonnen ruthlessness, all the calculating cruelty with none of the physical weaknesses that now afflicted the Baron's aging body. Fade was being trained to kill without hesitation, to manipulate without conscience, to view power as the only meaningful measure of human worth. The Baron's other nephew, Glossu Rabban, served a different purpose. The Beast Rabban, as he was known throughout the Imperium, provided crude brutality when that tool was needed. He lacked his uncle's sophistication, but his willingness to commit atrocities without moral reflection made him useful for certain operations. The Baron deployed Rabban the way a surgeon might use a hammer not for delicate work, but for breaking what needed to be broken. This family structure revealed much about Harkonnen planning. The Baron thought dynastically. building not just for his own lifetime but for generations of Harkonnen dominance. His vision extended beyond personal wealth to family legacy, to a future where Harkonnen controlled not just Arrakis but influenced the very direction of imperial policy through accumulated power and strategic positioning. The Baron's recognition of Arrakis as the ultimate strategic prize came not from abstract analysis, but from lived experience. 80 years of managing spice production had taught him exactly how the Imperium functioned, where its vulnerabilities lay, how completely every element of its civilization depended on the spice flow. He had watched the Guild navigators consume ever-increasing quantities of spice, their addiction growing deeper with each passing year. He had observed the Emperor's increasing nervousness about any disruption to spice supplies. He had calculated the exact economic impact of even minor reductions in spice availability. This knowledge transformed his understanding of power. The Emperor commanded Sardaukar legions, but those legions could not reach their targets without Guild transport. The Guild controlled space travel, but could not navigate without spice. Chom distributed wealth, but that wealth derived from spice commerce. Every center of power in the Imperium ultimately traced back to the deep deserts of Arrakis, to the spice blows and the harvesters and the infrastructure of extraction. Whoever truly controlled Arrakis, not as a temporary fiefholder, but as absolute master, could dictate terms to the Imperium itself. This was the Baron's ultimate ambition, the goal toward which 80 years of careful positioning had been directed. He did not want merely to manage Arrakis for profit. He wanted to own it so completely that he could use the spice supply as leverage to reshape the entire balance of imperial power. This ambition drove every calculation, informed every decision, justified every atrocity. The workers who died from dehydration, the Fremen hunted for sport, the officials corrupted, the rivals destroyed, all of it served the larger purpose of positioning House Harkonnen to seize control of humanity's essential resource. The Baron understood that such an ambition could not be achieved through conventional means. The Emperor would never permit a single house to control Arrakis permanently. The Guild would intervene before allowing their supply threatened. The great houses would unite against any attempt at monopoly. Traditional strategies led to traditional limitations, so the Baron conceived something extraordinary, a plan that would use the Imperium's own systems against itself, that would make his enemies accomplish his objectives while believing they served their own interests. He would not seize Arrakis through rebellion, which would unite opposition against him. Instead, he would manipulate the Emperor into granting him what he desired, into seeing Harkonnen control of Arrakis as necessary rather than threatening. The plan required a catalyst, an event so significant that it would justify extraordinary measures. It required a victim whose destruction would warn other houses against challenging Harkonnen interests, while demonstrating to the Emperor the necessity of Harkonnen management. It required timing so precise that every element fell into place before anyone could organize effective opposition. The Baron began to see the shape of this plan when the Emperor's growing fear of Duke Leto Atreides became apparent. Here was opportunity presenting itself in elegant symmetry. The Emperor needed Leto removed. The Baron needed validation of Harkonnen, indispensability, and Arrakis provided the perfect trap where both objectives could be achieved simultaneously. 80 years of extraction had prepared the Baron for this moment. He had built the military forces, corrupted the necessary officials, established the intelligence networks, and accumulated the wealth needed to execute a plan of extraordinary complexity. More importantly, he had developed the reputation for ruthless efficiency that made him seem like the natural solution to problems others could not solve. The Baron looked at Arrakis not as it was, but as it could be used. The desert planet was more than a source of spice. It was a weapon, a tool, a stage where the future of the Imperium could be determined. Control of Arrakis meant control of the lever that could move the entire structure of human civilization. The 80 years of extraction had been preparation, building toward a moment when that lever could be pulled with sufficient force to reshape the political landscape. In his private chambers on Giedi Prime, surrounded by the luxuries that vast wealth afforded, the Baron contemplated the machinery he had built. Every piece was positioned correctly. Every contingency had been planned for. Every vulnerability in his enemies had been identified and prepared for exploitation. The network of corruption bound key officials to his interests. The military forces waited for deployment. The intelligence operatives stood ready to activate. All that remained was the signal from the Emperor, the announcement that would set everything in motion. And the Baron knew, with the certainty born of decades studying the psychology of power, that signal would come. Shaddam's fear of Duke Leto Atreides was growing. The Emperor would act, and when he did, the Baron would be ready to turn that action to Harkonnen advantage. 80 years of calculated cruelty, systematic extraction, and patient positioning were about to pay their ultimate dividend. The Baron smiled, an expression of such cold satisfaction that those who served him looked away. They knew that smile meant someone would suffer, some plan would unfold, some piece would move across the board of imperial politics. They did not know that this time the plan would change everything. There is a particular species of hunting spider that builds no web. Instead, it creates a tunnel in the ground, lines it with silk, and waits at the entrance. When prey approaches, the spider emerges with such speed that escape becomes impossible. The victim never sees the trap until the moment of capture. In the year 10,191, Emperor Shaddam IV became such a spider, and Duke Leto Atreides, for all his wisdom and caution, walked toward the tunnel entrance. The Duke's problem was not that he lacked intelligence or strategic vision. His problem was that he possessed something more dangerous: integrity in an empire built on calculated betrayal, honor in a system that rewarded ruthlessness, and popularity in a political structure that could not tolerate anyone who threatened the delicate balance of power. Duke Leto Atreides ruled Caladan, an ocean world of such beauty that visitors often wept at first sight of its blue-green seas. His people loved him not with the fearful obedience that most houses commanded, but with genuine devotion. His administration was efficient without being oppressive, profitable without being exploitative. His troops fought with legendary discipline, not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted their duke would never waste their lives for vanity or careless strategy. This made him extraordinarily dangerous to the emperor. Consider the mathematics of imperial politics. The Padishah emperor's power rested not on absolute authority, but on his position as first among equals in the Landsraad. The great houses accepted his primacy because fragmenting into competing powers would be worse, because the Sardaukar gave him military supremacy, and because the system had functioned for 10,000 years. But these foundations were not permanent features of reality. They were arrangements maintained through careful balancing of incentives and threats. Duke Leto Atreides disrupted this balance simply by existing. His reputation for fairness attracted talented individuals who might otherwise have sought imperial service. His military success demonstrated that honorable leadership could achieve what brutality could not. His growing influence among the great houses suggested an alternative model of governance, one that did not require the emperor's particular blend of manipulation and force. Shaddam IV understood this threat with perfect clarity. The Duke had no ambitions toward the throne. Leto's honor was genuine, his loyalty real. But loyalty and honor made him no less dangerous. Perhaps more so, because his threat came not from active rebellion, but from passive example. If enough houses began to wonder whether they might thrive under Atreides-style governance, the entire structure of imperial authority would begin to erode. The emperor needed Duke Leto removed, but openly acting against him was impossible. Leto had committed no crime, broken no convention, violated no imperial law. A direct assassination would unite the Landsraad against the throne, as the great houses recognized that if the emperor could eliminate Leto for mere popularity, no house was safe. The Sardaukar could not be deployed against Caladan without transparent evidence of rebellion, which did not exist. Shaddam required something more elegant, a way to destroy Duke Leto that would appear as misfortune rather than murder, that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously, and that would strengthen rather than weaken the imperial position. The solution, when it came to him, was so perfect that he surely smiled in satisfaction at his own cleverness. He would give Duke Leto exactly what appeared to be an extraordinary honor: the quasi-fief of Arrakis, transferring control of spice production from House Harkonnen to House Atreides. Imagine receiving this news if you were Duke Leto. On the surface, it represented everything an ambitious house could desire. Arrakis was the most valuable fief in the Imperium. Control of spice production meant immense profits, political leverage, and central importance in imperial affairs. The transfer suggested imperial favor, recognition of Atreides' competence, and opportunity to build wealth and influence beyond anything Caladan could provide. But Duke Leto Atreides had not survived the deadly politics of the Landsraad by accepting apparent gifts without analysis. He understood immediately that this honor was actually a trap, though one so carefully constructed that refusing would be more dangerous than accepting. The strategic analysis his advisors provided painted the situation with brutal clarity. The Harkonnens had held Arrakis for 80 years and extracted enormous profits. They would not surrender this prize willingly. The transfer must therefore represent either imperial pressure or Harkonnen strategy, possibly both. The Baron was too clever to simply accept defeat. He would have prepared contingencies, perhaps planned the entire sequence of events. The timing of the transfer, coming as Atreides' influence grew in the Landsraad, suggested deliberate intent rather than random imperial whim. Moreover, Arrakis itself represented extraordinary danger. The planet was hostile to human life, requiring constant technological support for survival. The indigenous Fremen population, while officially small and primitive, had somehow survived centuries of Harkonnen oppression without being completely suppressed, suggesting capabilities beyond official estimates. The spice mining operations were complex and vulnerable to sabotage. The profit margins, while large, depended on maintaining production levels that the Harkonnens had, achieved through methods House Atreides could not morally replicate. Duke Leto's military advisor, Thufir Hawat, laid out the assessment with characteristic bluntness. Accepting the Arrakis quasi-fief meant leaving the security of Caladan for a hostile environment where every system would be unfamiliar, every person potentially a Harkonnen agent, and every day a risk of assassination. The Duke's forces would be stretched thin trying to secure a planet they did not understand. Supply lines would be vulnerable. Intelligence networks would need to be rebuilt from nothing in hostile territory. Yet refusing was equally dangerous. If Duke Leto declined the assignment, the Emperor could interpret it as an insult, as cowardice, or as evidence of disloyalty. The other great houses would see weakness, an unwillingness to accept challenges that came with greater responsibility. The Atreides' reputation for competence would suffer. Most critically, refusing would confirm the Emperor's suspicion that Leto harbored rebellious thoughts, that he preferred the security of Caladan because he was planning something that required a secure base. This was the brilliance of the trap. Either choice led to destruction. Accept and face probable assassination in an unfamiliar environment where enemies had every advantage. Refuse and face imperial suspicion, loss of reputation, and political isolation that would make the house vulnerable to eventual elimination through conventional means. Duke Leto made his decision with the full knowledge of its implications. He would accept the assignment to Arrakis, but he would not walk into the trap blindly. Instead, he would attempt something that had never been successfully achieved on Arrakis: building legitimate local power that could resist whatever attack the Baron launched. The strategy was audacious in its ambition and utterly dependent on factors outside Atreides' control. The Duke understood that conventional military preparation would be insufficient. The Harkonnens had 80 years of accumulated advantages, hidden assets, and prepared strategies. Instead, Leto would attempt to do what no off-world power had ever achieved: forge an alliance with the Fremen. Consider the logic of this approach. The Fremen were the one variable that Harkonnen planning might not have fully accounted for, because the Baron had spent 80 years dismissing them as insignificant. If the Fremen were actually more numerous and capable than official estimates suggested, and Atreides' intelligence was beginning to suspect they were, then they represented a potential military asset that could offset Harkonnen advantages. More importantly, an alliance with the Fremen would provide something House Atreides desperately needed: local legitimacy. Instead of being seen as just another off-world exploiter replacing previous off-world exploiters, the Atreides could position themselves as different, as willing to respect Fremen culture and work with the native population rather than merely extracting resources and crushing resistance. This strategy aligned perfectly with Duke Leto's character and House Atreides' reputation. They did not need to fake respect for the Fremen. Leto genuinely believed that treating people with dignity produced better results than brutality. The Atreides' approach to governance was not merely a cynical calculation, but a deeply held philosophy about how power should be exercised. If they could convince the Fremen that House Atreides represented genuine change, not just new management of the same exploitation, then perhaps they could build something that even Harkonnen military superiority could not easily destroy. Duke Leto dispatched his most trusted advisors to begin preparing for the transition. Duncan Idaho, the weapons master, would make contact with the Fremen, using his skills and personality to begin building relationships. Gurney Halleck would handle military preparations, training troops for desert warfare and security operations in hostile territory. Thufir Hawat would reconstruct intelligence networks from scratch, attempting to identify Harkonnen agents and understand the true situation on Arrakis. The Duke's concubine, Lady Jessica of the Bene Gesserit, provided another dimension of capability. The Sisterhood had its own interests on Arrakis, its own long-term plans that might or might not align with Atreides' interests. Jessica's training gave her skills in perception and manipulation that would be invaluable in the deadly politics ahead. Her son, Paul, was 15 years old, trained in both Bene Gesserit and Mentat disciplines, already showing unusual abilities that suggested he might become something extraordinary. The preparations proceeded with intense focus. Every ship captain was vetted. Every piece of equipment was inspected for sabotage. Every person making the journey to Arrakis was investigated for possible Harkonnen connections. The Duke knew that the Baron would have planted agents within his organization. It would be foolish to assume otherwise, but perhaps careful screening could identify the most obvious threats. Yet even as these preparations proceeded, Duke Leto faced an impossible calculation. How much resource should he commit to Arrakis? Move too much, and Caladan became vulnerable, providing an opening for other houses to seize Atreides' holdings. Move too little, and the forces on Arrakis would be insufficient to resist whatever the Baron launched. The Duke needed to appear confident while actually being terrified, needed to seem strong while feeling exposed, needed to project certainty while knowing that he was walking into a situation where failure meant not just death but the destruction of his house. The rapid diplomatic outreach to the Fremen began even before the Atreides officially took control of Arrakis. Duncan Idaho went first, his mission to make contact with Fremen leaders and assess whether an alliance was even possible. The reports he sent back were both encouraging and concerning. The Fremen were indeed more numerous than official estimates suggested, perhaps by orders of magnitude. They possessed capabilities in desert survival and combat that surpassed anything in the formal military forces of the great houses. Their culture was complex, deeply spiritual, and organized around prophecies that might be exploited or might complicate negotiations. But the Fremen were also suspicious, having been betrayed by off-worlders countless times over centuries of exploitation. Gaining their trust would require more than words. It would require demonstrable change in how Arrakis was governed, respect for Fremen autonomy, and sharing of water and resources in ways that violated every precedent of off-world control. The Duke would need to make himself vulnerable to demonstrate sincerity, which in turn would make him vulnerable to his real enemies. This was Duke Leto's fundamental miscalculation, though calling it a miscalculation implies he had better alternatives. He understood the trap, but believed that honor, competence, and rapid adaptation could spring it. He recognized the danger, but thought that building local legitimacy could create a position defensible against Harkonnen attack. He saw the trap closing, but calculated that the right moves might still achieve escape. What he failed to fully comprehend was the depth of conspiracy against him. The Duke knew the Emperor feared him. He suspected the Baron would attempt recapture of Arrakis. He prepared for assassination attempts, sabotage, and military action. But he could not grasp, because it exceeded the boundaries of conventional imperial politics, that the Emperor and Baron had entered into direct cooperation, that Shaddam would commit his own Sardaukar troops to ensure Atreides' destruction. This possibility should have been unthinkable. The Emperor using Sardaukar against a loyal house without evidence of rebellion violated every precedent that maintained the stability of the Imperium. Such an action, if discovered, would unite the Landsraad against the throne and potentially trigger civil war. No emperor had ever taken such a risk for the mere convenience of eliminating a popular duke. But Shaddam IV was not merely eliminating a popular duke. He was preventing what he saw as an existential threat to imperial authority. He was demonstrating that no amount of popularity or competence could protect a house if it threatened the emperor's position. He was willing to risk everything on the calculation that if the operation succeeded, no one would ever know Sardaukar involvement, and if it failed, he could claim the troops were renegades acting without imperial authorization. Duke Leto's second fatal miscalculation involved trust. The Duke's greatest strength, his ability to inspire loyalty through honorable treatment, created a vulnerability he could not fully protect against. He trusted his people because they had earned that trust, and most of them deserved it. But trust, once established, created patterns of behavior that could be exploited by someone sufficiently ruthless to target them. Dr. Wellington Yue represented this vulnerability in its purest form. A Suk doctor, conditioned against taking human life, certified as absolutely reliable through imperial conditioning that supposedly could not be broken. Duke Leto trusted Yue completely, as did everyone else who understood what Suk conditioning meant. The doctor had access to the Duke's private quarters, to security systems, to the most intimate details of Atreides' operations. The Baron's intelligence network had identified Yue's wife as leverage point years earlier. They had captured her, held her in circumstances of such carefully calibrated torment that Yue would do anything, even violate his supposedly unbreakable conditioning, to end her suffering. The Baron had broken Yue not through crude threats, but through exploitation of love itself, turning the doctor's devotion to his wife into a weapon against everything he held sacred. Duke Leto could not have defended against this because defending against it would have required either not trusting anyone, which would have destroyed the very culture that made House Atreides effective, or recognizing that the Baron would torture an innocent woman for years to create a single exploitable asset. The Duke understood the Baron was ruthless. He did not understand the precise depths of that ruthlessness, the willingness to invest years in breaking a single individual in order to gain a single opportunity. This failure of imagination was itself a product of character. Duke Leto Atreides could conceive of necessary violence, strategic deception, even assassination when required, but he could not truly conceive of the kind of mind that would torture someone for years solely to create an opportunity that might never come, that would calculate human suffering in the same way one might calculate resource allocation, that would view love itself as weakness to be weaponized. The preparations continued through months of frantic activity. Ships were loaded with equipment, troops, and supplies. Personnel were briefed on desert conditions and security protocols. Intelligence networks strained to identify threats before the move even occurred. The Duke met with his advisors daily, reviewing plans, adjusting strategies, seeking any edge that might improve their chances of survival. Yet even as these preparations proceeded, Duke Leto knew he was playing a game where the rules were hidden and the opponent had years of preparation. He was attempting to build in months what the Harkonnens had developed over decades. He was trying to create alliances with people who had no reason to trust off-worlders. He was moving into an environment specifically selected by his enemies to maximize Atreides' vulnerability. The night before the final departure from Caladan, Duke Leto stood on a balcony overlooking the ocean, watching waves crash against rocks that had witnessed 10,000 years of Atreides' governance. His son Paul stood beside him, silent, sensing his father's mood. The Duke knew this might be the last time he saw Caladan. He knew the probability of survival on Arrakis was poor. He knew he was leading his people into a trap that could destroy everything his ancestors had built. But refusing was impossible. Moving forward was suicide. So he would move forward with dignity, attempting to spring a trap through competence and honor, hoping that building legitimacy among the Fremen might create defensive positions sufficient to survive the storm he knew was coming. The harder the place, the stronger the test, the Duke said quietly, more to himself than to his son. It was an Atreides saying, a justification for accepting difficult challenges, a reminder that character revealed itself through adversity. Paul said nothing, but he felt something in that moment, a prescience not yet fully developed, a sense of pathways branching from this decision, futures splitting based on choices not yet made. He could not yet see clearly, but he sensed the weight of what was coming, the terrible momentum of events already set in motion. The Duke turned from the ocean and walked back inside. There was work to do, final preparations to complete, a house to transport across the galaxy into hostile territory. He would do what needed to be done with the competence that defined Atreides' governance. He would attempt to build something on Arrakis that reflected Atreides' values, and if he failed, if the trap closed around him, at least he would fail while attempting something worthy rather than cowering in safety while his reputation died. This was Duke Leto's true miscalculation, the assumption embedded so deeply in his character that he could not question it, that honor and competence mattered more than raw power, that building legitimacy could counter overwhelming force, that doing what was right had inherent value even if it led to destruction. In a universe where the Emperor conspired with the Baron, where Sardaukar would disguise themselves as Harkonnen troops, where a doctor's conditioning could be broken through years of torture, where the entire apparatus of imperial power focused on destroying a single house simply because its duke was too honorable and too popular in this universe, Duke Leto's faith in the power of integrity was his fatal flaw. The ships lifted from Caladan carrying everything Duke Leto valued: his people, his son, his concubine, his advisors, his troops, his dreams of building something better than what the Harkonnens had created. They carried also his doom, though he did not fully recognize it. The trap was closing, the spider emerging, and the Duke walked forward with his eyes open but his vision obscured by the very qualities that made him worthy of survival. In the deep desert of Arrakis, the Fremen watched the sky and wondered what this change in off-world masters would mean. Some hoped for better treatment, some expected more of the same exploitation. A few, versed in the prophecies that gave shape to Fremen spirituality, wondered if perhaps this time something different was beginning, if perhaps the Lisan al-Gaib was coming. They could not know that in the hold of one of those ships, a boy named Paul Atreides was experiencing visions of futures that terrified him, seeing pathways of violence stretching across the galaxy, unable yet to understand what he was witnessing or what role he would play in events to come. The careful strategy Duke Leto had constructed, the diplomatic outreach, the attempt to build local legitimacy, the hope of forging Fremen alliance into defensive position. All of it was based on one fundamental assumption: that he would have time to implement it, that the Baron would wait before striking, that there would be opportunity to build what needed to be built. This assumption was wrong. The Baron did not intend to give Duke Leto time to build anything. The trap was already sprung. The Duke simply had not yet felt its jaws close around him. In nature, the most successful predators are not those with the sharpest claws or the strongest jaws, but those who coordinate their attacks with such precision that prey has no avenue of escape. A pack of wolves circles its target, each member positioned to cut off retreat, the kill achieved not through individual strength but through flawless cooperation. On the night the Atreides fell, three powers, the Emperor, the Baron, and the Spacing Guild, achieved such coordination. What followed was not battle, but execution. The conspiracy had been years in the making, though Duke Leto never saw its full shape until the moment it destroyed him. The Emperor needed the Duke eliminated but could not act openly. The Baron needed Arrakis reclaimed but could not take it by force without Imperial opposition. The Guild needed spice production maintained but feared any disruption from house warfare. Each power had its own interests, its own constraints, its own reasons for wanting Atreides' destruction. The genius of the conspiracy was that it served all three purposes simultaneously while appearing to serve none. The Baron would attack using Harkonnen forces, thus taking public responsibility and absorbing any political consequences. The Emperor would provide Sardaukar troops disguised as Harkonnen soldiers, thus ensuring overwhelming force without visible Imperial involvement. The Guild would transport the attack force and maintain silence about Imperial participation, thus securing their spice supply without appearing to choose sides in house politics. Consider the careful planning required to coordinate such an operation. The Sardaukar could not simply join Harkonnen troops and hope no one noticed the difference in training and capabilities. They needed to wear Harkonnen uniforms, use Harkonnen equipment, follow Harkonnen operational protocols. More critically, they needed to ensure that no Atreides survivor could testify about their involvement. The attack had to be so swift and complete that evidence of Imperial participation died with the defenders. The Baron's preparation had been meticulous. For months before the Atreides arrived, his agents had been positioning assets, weapons, and intelligence networks throughout the Arrakis infrastructure. The Atreides would inherit a system riddled with sabotage waiting to be triggered, loyal Harkonnen operatives pretending to be neutral personnel, and security vulnerabilities carefully engineered into every defensive system. Most importantly, the Baron had Dr. Yue positioned within the Atreides household. The Suk doctor's conditioning had been broken through years of psychological torture focused on his wife, Wanna. The Baron held her in conditions specifically designed to maximize Yue's desperation while keeping her alive as leverage. He offered the doctor a terrible bargain. Betray Duke Leto and Wanna's suffering would end. The Baron would kill her quickly, mercifully, ending the torment that had continued for years. Yue knew he was being manipulated. He understood the Baron would never truly show mercy. But after years of knowing his wife suffered while he remained helpless, the doctor had reached a point where even a false promise of ending her pain seemed worth any price. His conditioning against taking life had been eroded not through breaking the conditioning itself, but through reframing the betrayal as an act of mercy, ending his wife's suffering, even if it meant sacrificing everything else he valued. This psychological precision revealed the Baron's true genius. He did not merely break Yue through crude threats. He transformed the doctor's love into a weapon, his compassion into a vulnerability, his deepest held values into the mechanism of his betrayal. Yue would disable the defensive shields surrounding the Atreides stronghold, providing the Baron's forces access to a supposedly impregnable position. The night of the attack, Duke Leto Atreides sat in his study reviewing production reports and security briefings. He had been on Arrakis for only a few weeks, barely enough time to understand the complexity of spice operations or begin building the Fremen alliances that might have provided protection. He knew danger was imminent. Every security assessment confirmed that Harkonnen agents had infiltrated multiple systems. But he could not know that the danger was not imminent but present, not building but already triggered, not a future threat but an attack already underway. Doctor. Yue approached the Duke with a story about a critical security matter that required immediate private attention. Leto trusted him absolutely. A Suk doctor's conditioning was supposed to make betrayal impossible. This trust was his final mistake. Yue disabled the Duke with a paralytic agent, apologizing even as he committed treason, explaining in broken whispers that he had no choice, that the Baron held his wife, that he was trying to give the Duke one final chance for revenge, even as he handed him to his enemies. Yue implanted a false tooth in the Duke's mouth, containing a deadly gas that would kill anyone in the immediate vicinity when released. If the Baron brought Leto into close quarters, if the Duke could trigger the gas release, he might kill his enemy even in death. It was a desperate hope, a microscopic chance of revenge, but Yue offered it as the only compensation he could provide for his betrayal. While the Duke lay paralyzed in his study, unable to move or call for help, the Baron's forces struck. The defensive shields that should have protected the Atreides stronghold went down simultaneously across all sectors. Attack ships appeared above the compound, their weapons targeting defensive positions, command centers, communication arrays. Troops poured through breaches in the walls, moving with a precision that suggested detailed intelligence about Atreides' defensive arrangements. The Atreides troops fought with the discipline that had made them legendary throughout the Landsraad. Duncan Idaho led a desperate defense of the armory, buying time for others to escape, knowing he would die but determined to make that death expensive for the attackers. Gurney Halleck organized a fighting retreat, trying to evacuate key personnel while maintaining defensive positions. Thufir Hawat, the master of assassins, attempted to coordinate a response even as he realized the attack was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, that the defensive systems had been compromised, that this was not a conventional assault but systematic elimination. But courage and skill could not overcome such overwhelming force and complete surprise. The defenders had expected eventual Harkonnen attack. They had not expected Sardaukar-level troops operating with full intelligence about Atreides' defensive positions. The fighting was brutal but brief. Positions that should have held for hours fell in minutes. Defenders who should have had time to organize effective resistance found themselves overrun before they could establish coherent defensive lines. The true horror was not in the violence itself, but in its efficiency. This was not warfare but extermination, carried out with such systematic precision that it resembled an industrial process more than a battle. The attackers knew exactly where key personnel would be, exactly which systems to target first, exactly how to minimize their own casualties while maximizing Atreides' destruction. Lady Jessica and her son Paul escaped through a combination of skill and preparation. Jessica's Bene Gesserit training gave her capabilities that ordinary attackers could not anticipate. Paul's emerging prescient abilities allowed him to sense danger before it materialized. They fled into the desert, carrying nothing but stillsuits and the knowledge that they were now hunted by forces that had just destroyed everything they valued. The Baron arrived after the primary assault ended, surveying the destruction with satisfaction. He had the paralyzed Duke Leto brought before him, wanting to savor this moment of triumph. Years of planning had led to this confrontation. 80 years of building wealth and power from Arrakis, the careful cultivation of imperial favor, the patient corruption of key officials, the systematic preparation of this trap. All of it had been directed toward this goal, reclaiming Arrakis and eliminating the most significant obstacle to Harkonnen dominance. The Baron taunted Duke Leto, explaining elements of the conspiracy, revealing that the Emperor himself had provided Sardaukar troops, demonstrating that the Atreides' defeat had been inevitable from the moment they accepted the Arrakis assignment. He wanted the Duke to understand the completeness of his failure, to recognize that honor and competence had been insufficient against coordinated conspiracy. Duke Leto Atreides, paralyzed and defeated, had one remaining action available to him. The false tooth Yue had implanted contained poison gas. If he could bring the Baron close enough, if he could trigger the release, he might achieve in death what he could not achieve in life, the elimination of his house's greatest enemy. The Duke triggered the gas release. The poison cloud erupted around him, filling the immediate area with lethal toxins. For a moment, the Baron's triumph seemed about to transform into his own destruction. But Vladimir Harkonnen had not survived decades of deadly politics without developing paranoid security protocols. His personal shields activated instantly, and his suspensor belt lifted him away from the gas cloud before the toxins could take full effect. The Baron survived. Duke Leto Atreides died, achieving nothing with his final act, except confirmation that even in death, honor was insufficient weapon against opponents who anticipated every move. The political aftermath unfolded with the precision that had characterized the attack itself. The Baron immediately sent messages to the Spacing Guild and the Emperor, confirming that Arrakis had been secured, that spice production would resume without interruption, that the brief disruption posed no threat to the essential supply. The Guild, satisfied that their interests had been protected, maintained their silence about what they had witnessed. The Emperor received reports that House Atreides had attempted to seize control of Arrakis for their own purposes, that they had been planning to use spice supply as leverage against the throne, that their rebellion had been crushed by loyal Harkonnen forces acting to protect imperial interests. The justification was transparent fiction, but it provided sufficient cover for Tutin Day Shaddam to deny any imperial involvement while accepting the Harkonnen restoration to Arrakis governance. The great houses of the Landsraad received news of Atreides' destruction with shock and fear. Duke Leto had been popular, respected, admired for his competence and honor. His elimination sent a clear message. No amount of popularity or capability could protect a house if it threatened interests of those with sufficient power and ruthlessness. The Landsraad accepted the official fiction about Atreides' rebellion because challenging it would mean acknowledging that the Emperor had conspired to eliminate a loyal house, which would undermine the entire foundation of imperial authority. This was perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the conspiracy. It destroyed not just House Atreides, but the very possibility of protest against their destruction. To speak publicly about imperial involvement would be to accuse the emperor of violating the most fundamental principles of the Imperium. No single house would risk such accusation without overwhelming support from other houses, and no house wanted to provide that support when doing so might make them the next target. The Baron's calculation that survivor Paul posed minimal threat proved to be his one error, though not one he could have reasonably avoided. A 15-year-old boy fleeing into the desert with his mother, hunted by Harkonnen forces, separated from all support and resources. What threat could such a refugee possibly represent? The rational assessment suggested Paul would die within days in the Arrakis desert, killed by exposure, thirst, or sandworms if Harkonnen patrols did not find him first. This assessment failed to account for several factors that existed outside normal strategic calculation. Paul was not merely the Duke's son, but the product of generations of Bene Gesserit breeding programs designed to create unusual genetic combinations. His mother was not just a concubine, but a Bene Gesserit sister, with capabilities that surpassed normal human limits. The Fremen were not primitive desert dwellers, but a sophisticated warrior culture with survival skills honed over centuries. And Arrakis itself, the deep desert that seemed so hostile to human life, was about to reveal itself as a forge that could transform a refugee into something unprecedented. But on the night of the Atreides fall, these possibilities remained hidden. The conspiracy had achieved complete success. The Emperor had eliminated a threat to his authority while maintaining deniability. The Baron had reclaimed Arrakis and positioned himself as the indispensable manager of spice production. The Guild had secured their supply without visible involvement in house politics. Every conspirator had achieved their objectives. The systematic elimination of the Atreides command structure proceeded through the following days. Duncan Idaho had died holding the armory, his body found surrounded by enemies he had killed even as overwhelming force brought him down. Gurney Halleck was reported dead. Though his body was never recovered, he had actually escaped into the desert, though the Baron did not know this. Thufir Hawat had been captured alive, his capabilities as a mentat too valuable to waste. The Baron calculating that the old master of assassins could be turned to Harkonnen service through careful manipulation. The troops who had fought so bravely were dead or scattered. The administrators who had managed Atreides operations were eliminated or fled. The intelligence networks that had begun building were dismantled. The diplomatic outreach to the Fremen was interrupted before it could achieve meaningful results. In a single night of coordinated violence, everything Duke Leto had attempted to build on Arrakis was destroyed. The Baron stood in the captured Atreides stronghold and contemplated his victory. He had achieved what he set out to achieve. Arrakis was his again, this time with the Emperor's implicit blessing. The threat posed by Atreides' competence and popularity had been eliminated. The other great houses had been reminded of what happened to those who threatened the established order, and he had demonstrated his own indispensability when the Emperor needed a difficult problem solved. When the spice supply required protection, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was the obvious solution. Yet even in this moment of triumph, elements of doubt existed. Lady Jessica and Paul had escaped into the desert. The Fremen response to the attack remained uncertain. The long-term stability of Harkonnen control would depend on factors not entirely within the Baron's control. But these were minor concerns compared to the completeness of his victory. A few fugitives in the desert could not threaten the machinery of control he had rebuilt. The Emperor Shaddam IV received confirmation that his most serious political threat had been eliminated without traceable imperial involvement. He had demonstrated that no house, regardless of popularity or competence, could challenge his authority and survive. The Sardaukar troops returned to their hidden training grounds, their role in the operation never officially acknowledged. The Emperor's satisfaction was complete. He had solved a dangerous problem while strengthening his own position. The Spacing Guild navigators, immersed in their spice-induced prescience, perceived disturbances in the timelines surrounding Arrakis. Their visions showed possible futures branching in unusual ways, patterns that suggested something significant had occurred or was about to occur. But their perception was limited by their own dependence on spice. They saw possibilities but could not determine which future would actualize. The spice flowed, their immediate interests were protected, and the deeper implications of what had occurred remained hidden even from their prescient vision. In the deep desert, far from the compound where Duke Leto had died, the Fremen watched the sky lit by explosions and considered what this violence meant for their future. Some argued it was merely another transition between off-world masters, meaning nothing would change. Others suggested that perhaps this presented opportunity, that chaos among the off-worlders might allow Fremen to seize greater control of their own planet. A few, versed in the prophecies, wondered if the fall of the Atreides might somehow be connected to the coming of the Lisan al-Gaib. They could not know that in the desert south of the violence, two figures struggled through sand and heat, fighting for survival in conditions that would kill most humans within hours. They could not know that one of these figures carried within him genetic potential and prescient abilities that would transform the political landscape of the entire Imperium. They could not know that the conspiracy's apparent triumph had actually set in motion a sequence of events that would destroy everything the conspirators had carefully built. The perfect assassination had succeeded completely. Every objective had been achieved. Every contingency had been planned for. Every threat had been eliminated or neutralized. The Baron, the Emperor, and the Guild had coordinated flawlessly to destroy House Atreides and secure their own interests. What they failed to consider was that the greatest threats often emerge not from visible enemies, but from variables the system does not recognize as significant. A boy fleeing into the desert, a native population dismissed as primitive, a planet whose ecology shaped human development in unexpected ways. These elements existed outside the calculations that had made the conspiracy succeed so completely. The night of the Atreides' fall, the conspirators believed they had achieved permanent victory. They had eliminated a threat, secured a resource, and demonstrated their power to shape events according to their will. The machinery of their success had functioned perfectly, every element working exactly as planned. But in complex systems, perfect execution of a plan based on incomplete understanding can lead to catastrophic failure. The conspirators had calculated correctly according to their models of how the Imperium functioned. What they had not calculated was that the Imperium itself was about to be transformed by forces that existed outside those models, by a boy who could see futures they could not imagine, by a people they had never properly counted, by a desert that was about to reveal itself as the crucible where the future would be forged. The conspiracy had triumphed. The celebration of that triumph would be brief, though those celebrating did not yet know this. In the deep desert, something new was beginning, something that would make their careful victory irrelevant, something that would reshape the Imperium more completely than any conspiracy could achieve. The perfect assassination had succeeded. Its success would prove to be the conspirators' greatest mistake. There is a species of cactus in Earth's deserts that can survive years without rain, its roots spread wide to capture the briefest moisture, its flesh designed to store every precious drop. When rain finally comes, it blooms with such sudden beauty that observers marvel at the transformation. Paul Atreides, fleeing into the Arrakis wasteland with nothing but his life and his training, was about to discover that humans too could transform in response to harsh conditions, that survival in the deep desert required becoming something other than what off-world civilization had shaped him to be. The first days were pure survival. Paul and his mother Jessica, guided by Fremen they encountered in the deep desert, learned what it meant to exist where water was life, and every action was measured against moisture loss. The still suits they wore were not merely technology, but philosophy made wearable garments that captured body moisture, recirculated it, returned it to the wearer in a closed cycle that made survival possible in conditions that would kill an unprotected human within hours. But the Fremen who found them taught lessons that went far beyond equipment. They demonstrated how to walk without rhythm, how to move across sand in patterns that would not attract sandworms. They showed how to read the desert's moods, how to find moisture in places that appeared absolutely dry, how to predict sandstorms from subtle changes in air pressure and light. Most importantly, they revealed through their very existence that the desert was not humanity's enemy, but a harsh teacher that demanded absolute discipline in exchange for survival. Paul absorbed these lessons with an intensity that surprised even his Fremen guides. His Bene Gesserit training had prepared him to learn quickly, to observe patterns others missed, to adapt to unfamiliar situations. His mentat capabilities allowed him to process information with computer-like precision. But beyond these formal skills existed something else, an emerging prescience that let him see possible futures branching from present actions, consequences that had not yet occurred but which his mind could somehow perceive. This prescience was both gift and curse. Paul could see that certain actions led to survival, while others led to death. He could perceive opportunities that would not be visible to normal human awareness. But he also glimpsed something more disturbing, distant futures, where his actions led to jihad, spreading across the galaxy, where his name became synonymous with holy war that killed billions, where the boy fleeing for his life transformed into something monstrous. These visions terrified him, but in the immediate present, survival demanded his full attention. The Fremen who had found them brought Paul and Jessica to Sietch Tabor, one of the major Fremen communities hidden deep in the desert. Here, in caves carved from rock and concealed from satellite observation, lived thousands of people the Imperium had dismissed as primitives. Their society was complex, spiritual, organized around water conservation and survival disciplines that would seem obsessive to off-worlders, but which made perfect sense in an environment where moisture meant life. Paul faced immediate challenges to his presence. The Fremen did not simply accept refugees, even those fleeing Harkonnen oppression. Their resources were limited, their security paramount, their survival dependent on maintaining absolute secrecy about their true numbers and capabilities. For Paul to remain in the Sietch, he needed to prove his value, to demonstrate that he could contribute more than he consumed, to show respect for Fremen ways while earning respect for his own capabilities. The testing came through combat. Jamis, a Fremen warrior, challenged Paul to a duel to the death. In Fremen culture, this was not mere violence but a fundamental sorting mechanism. Those who could not defend themselves in personal combat could not survive in the harsh conditions that defined Fremen existence. Paul had been trained in combat by some of the finest weapons masters in the Imperium, but this would be his first time killing another human being in direct, personal confrontation. The duel was brief and decisive. Paul's training and emerging prescient abilities allowed him to anticipate Jamis's attacks, to move in ways that seemed almost supernatural to observers. When Jamis died on Paul's blade, something shifted in the Sietch's perception of this off-world refugee. He was not merely a boy fleeing destruction, but someone with capabilities that might be valuable, someone who might contribute to Fremen interests rather than simply consuming Fremen resources. But Paul's strategic assessment extended far beyond proving himself in a single combat. He understood, with clarity that would have impressed his father, that his survival depended on building a power base that could eventually challenge the Baron's control of Arrakis. He had no army, no resources, no political connections, no leverage of any conventional kind. What he had was access to the Fremen, a population that the Imperium had systematically undercounted and underestimated for generations. Consider the mathematics of the situation. The Imperium believed perhaps 10,000 Fremen existed scattered across Arrakis. Paul's assessment suggested the true number might exceed 10 million. This represented the greatest intelligence failure in Imperial history. A population miscounted by 3 orders of magnitude, capabilities dismissed as primitive when they actually represented sophisticated adaptation to the harshest human environment known to exist. But numbers alone were insufficient. The Fremen needed to be transformed from scattered desert tribes into a unified military force capable of challenging imperial power. This transformation required something Paul's father had attempted but had not had time to achieve: building genuine trust, demonstrating respect for Fremen culture, proving that this off-worlder represented real change rather than merely different management of familiar exploitation. Paul approached this challenge with a combination of calculation and genuine respect that made him uniquely suited to the task. His Bene Gesserit training let him perceive the psychological and cultural patterns that governed Fremen behavior. His Mentat capabilities allowed him to identify the leverage points where small actions could produce large effects. But beyond these analytical skills, Paul actually believed that the Fremen deserved respect, that their adaptation to Arrakis represented an achievement worthy of admiration rather than dismissal. This authenticity mattered. The Fremen had centuries of experience with off-worlders who claimed to respect them while actually viewing them as obstacles to resource extraction. They could detect insincerity with the same precision they used to detect traces of moisture in apparently dry sand. Paul's genuine respect for their capabilities, his willingness to learn from them rather than assuming off-world superiority, created trust that calculation alone could never have achieved. The Fremen had their own prophecies, legends spread over centuries about the coming of the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world who would lead them to paradise, who would transform Arrakis into a green world where water flowed freely. These prophecies had been carefully planted by the Bene Gesserit as part of their long-term programs to create psychological conditioning that might be exploited by future Bene Gesserit operatives. Paul's mother Jessica understood this, recognized that her son was positioned to fulfill these planted prophecies, to use them as leverage for building Fremen loyalty. Paul himself felt conflicted about exploiting religious faith for political purposes. His prescience showed him futures where religious fervor became uncontrollable, where well-intentioned manipulation of prophecy led to jihad that consumed civilizations. Yet he also saw that without the Fremen, without building their loyalty through whatever means were available, he would die in the desert or be captured by Harkonnen forces. Survival demanded using every tool available, even tools that might ultimately prove dangerous. The strategic marriage alliance with Chani, daughter of Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist, represented Paul's understanding of how to bind himself to Fremen leadership structures. This was not merely personal attraction, though Paul genuinely cared for Chani, but calculated positioning. Through this alliance, Paul connected himself to key tribal leaders, demonstrated his commitment to Fremen ways by accepting a Fremen partner, and created family bonds that would obligate large segments of the Fremen population to support him. Fremen culture placed immense weight on water-sharing rituals and family obligations. By marrying Chani, according to Fremen custom, by participating fully in Sietch life rather than maintaining off-world separateness, Paul transformed himself from refugee into insider. He was no longer Paul Atreides, the off-world noble fleeing destruction, but Paul Muad'Dib, the name he took meaning, the one who points the way, a desert creature adapted to harsh conditions, someone who belonged to Arrakis rather than merely using it. This transformation was more than symbolic. Paul began training Fremen warriors in advanced combat techniques his father's weapons masters had taught him. He shared knowledge of shield fighting, tactical coordination, strategic planning that went beyond the individual combat skills Fremen already possessed. In return, he learned from them desert survival that surpassed anything off-world training could teach. Integration with the planet's ecology, understanding of sandworm behavior that allowed travel across open sand, spiritual disciplines that deepened his own emerging prescient abilities. The intelligence gathering about planetary operations proceeded systematically. Paul needed to understand exactly how spice production functioned, where vulnerabilities existed, how the economic flows worked that made Arrakis so valuable. The Fremen had observed Harkonnen operations for decades, understanding far more about spice extraction than the Baron would have believed possible. They knew the locations of major harvesting operations, the patterns of ornithopter patrols, the routines of troops garrisoning key facilities. More importantly, they understood the planetary ecology in ways that off-worlders never had. The Fremen knew that sandworms and spice production were intimately connected, that the massive creatures were actually part of the spice life cycle, rather than merely dangerous obstacles to harvesting operations. They understood that threatening the sandworms meant threatening spice production itself, that someone willing to disrupt the planetary ecology could hold the spice supply hostage in ways conventional military action could never achieve. Paul absorbed this knowledge and began to see the shape of a strategy that his father would have recognized, using asymmetric advantages to counter overwhelming conventional force. The Harkonnen controlled the cities, the spice harvesting equipment, the air power, the off-world supply lines. But the Fremen controlled the desert itself, the deep sand where no Harkonnen patrol could safely venture, the hidden setches that satellites could not detect, the knowledge of how to turn the planet's own ecology into a weapon, the careful cultivation of religious fervor as a political weapon proceeded with increasing sophistication. Paul did not merely accept the role of Lisan al-Gaib, he actively performed it, fulfilling prophecies in ways that seemed miraculous to Fremen observers. His prescience allowed him to make predictions that appeared to demonstrate supernatural knowledge. His combat abilities seemed to validate claims of divine favor. His willingness to embrace Fremen customs while bringing new capabilities suggested he was indeed the transformative figure their prophecies had promised. Jessica supported this process, using her Bene Gesserit training to deepen the religious conditioning, to create rituals and ceremonies that bound the Fremen ever more tightly to Paul's leadership. Mother and son both understood they were playing with forces that could become uncontrollable, but in the immediate term, survival demanded building loyalty through whatever means proved effective. The training of Fremen in advanced warfare techniques transformed them from formidable individual fighters into a military force of unprecedented capability. The Fremen already possessed physical conditioning that surpassed elite Imperial troops. Their desert survival training made them harder, faster, more resilient than soldiers who had not adapted to such harsh conditions. What they lacked was tactical coordination, strategic planning, and sophisticated understanding of how to fight enemies with technological advantages. Paul provided this missing element. He taught squad-level tactics, communication protocols, methods for coordinating large-scale operations. He showed them how to use their desert knowledge as tactical advantage rather than merely survival skill. He demonstrated how superior numbers and motivation could overcome technological superiority if applied with proper strategy. Most importantly, he gave them something they had never possessed: unified command structure and strategic vision that extended beyond tribal concerns to planetary scale objectives. Imagine the transformation this represented. The Fremen had survived for centuries as scattered tribes, each sietch autonomous, cooperation between groups limited and temporary. Paul was forging them into something unprecedented, a unified military force numbering in the millions. each warrior possessing capabilities that matched or exceeded Imperial Sardaukar, all of them bound by religious fervor to a single leader who could see futures they could not imagine. The identification of spice production as an economic leverage point became central to Paul's long-term strategy. He understood, as his father had understood, that the entire Imperium depended on continuous spice flow from Arrakis. Disrupting that flow would force a response from the Emperor, the Guild, and every power structure that depended on spice for their continued functioning. The threat of spice destruction was perhaps the only leverage that could force Imperial powers to negotiate rather than simply crushing a rebel force through overwhelming military superiority. But this strategy carried terrible risks. Threatening spice production meant threatening the basis of human civilization's expansion across the galaxy. The Guild could not navigate without spice. The Bene Gesserit could not maintain their abilities without spice. The elite throughout the Imperium could not extend their lives without spice. Threatening to destroy the spice cycle was threatening to collapse interstellar civilization itself. Paul's prescience showed him the consequences of such action. He could see futures where his threat proved credible enough to force surrender. He could also see futures where the Guild and Emperor chose to destroy Arrakis completely rather than allow anyone to hold such leverage. Futures where his gamble killed billions. The moral weight of these potential deaths pressed on him, yet he could see no alternative pathway that led to survival and eventual victory. The long-term strategy of sanctuary, recruitment, and eventual counterattack took shape over months of careful preparation. Paul established the deep desert as sanctuary where Harkonnen forces could not reach. He systematically recruited from every sietch, building a coalition that crossed traditional tribal boundaries. He prepared for counterattack by identifying targets, developing strategies, and building the capabilities needed to strike at Harkonnen vulnerabilities. This preparation occurred while the Baron believed he had complete control of Arrakis, while the Emperor assumed the Atreides threat had been permanently eliminated, while the Guild continued their navigation without concern about the political situation on the Spice Planet. None of these powers recognized that in the deep desert, hidden from satellites and patrols, a force was being forged that would challenge everything they had built. Paul understood that merely defeating the Baron would be insufficient. The Emperor had participated in his father's murder. The entire structure of imperial power had conspired to destroy House Atreides. Revenge against the Baron alone would leave the larger conspiracy unpunished, and would likely result in Paul's own eventual elimination. His strategy needed to be more comprehensive, not merely reclaiming Arrakis, but forcing a fundamental redistribution of imperial power itself. This ambition would have been insane if spoken aloud. A teenage boy, a refugee with no army and no resources, planning to challenge the Emperor of the known universe, to force concessions from powers that had ruled for 10,000 years, to reshape the political structure of human civilization through leverage derived from control of a single planet's ecology. Yet Paul's prescience showed him that this impossible ambition was actually achievable, that the pieces were falling into position, that the conspirators who had destroyed his father had inadvertently created the conditions for their own destruction. The months in the deep desert transformed Paul in ways that went beyond strategic capability. The boy who had fled into the wasteland had been shaped by off-world civilization, by palace life, by assumptions about how power functioned and what was possible. The young man emerging from this crucible understood power in a more fundamental way. He had learned to survive where survival seemed impossible, to build loyalty where none existed, to find leverage where none appeared to exist, to use faith as weapon and ecology as strategy. More disturbing to Paul himself was the change in his moral calculus. The Duke's son had believed in honor, in fairness, in using power justly. Muad'Dib understood that survival and victory sometimes required actions that honor would not permit, that building the force needed to challenge the emperor meant exploiting religious faith he knew was based on manipulated prophecy, that defeating his enemies would require threatening actions whose consequences might destroy more than the targets he intended. His prescience showed him the futures branching from his choices. He could see the path that led to victory, and he could see that same path led to jihad spreading across the galaxy, to billions of deaths, to his name becoming synonymous with religious warfare. He could also see that refusing this path meant his own death, the permanent triumph of those who had murdered his father, and the continuation of exploitation that had characterized Arrakis for centuries. This was the terrible knowledge his prescience brought him. He could see the catastrophic consequences of his actions, and yet could find no alternative that did not lead to worse outcomes. He could prevent the jihad by dying in the desert, but that death would change nothing for the Fremen, nothing for the Imperium, nothing except allowing conspirators to escape consequences for their actions. So Paul chose the terrible path, knowing what it would cost, unable to find better alternatives, driven by forces both internal and external toward futures that horrified him even as he worked to bring them about. He built his power base in the deep desert, forged the Fremen into a weapon of unprecedented capability, prepared to strike at the heart of imperial power with leverage derived from ecology and religious fervor. The Baron believed Arrakis was secure. The Emperor believed the Atreides threat had been eliminated. The Guild believed spice production would continue without disruption. All of them were wrong, though they would not discover their error until Paul chose to reveal what he had built in the deep desert, hidden from observation, growing in power, while appearing to be nothing more than scattered desert tribes that posed no serious threat to those who controlled the cities and the spice harvesting operations. In the Siege, Fremen warriors trained with techniques that would have impressed imperial military observers. In the deep desert, Paul Muad'Dib practiced prescient vision that showed him pathways through impossible situations. Throughout Arrakis, the pieces were moving into position for a confrontation that would reshape human civilization more completely than any event since the Butlerian Jihad had ended the age of thinking machines. The desert had been the Baron's weapon against Duke Leto, a hostile environment that amplified every Atreides vulnerability. Now it was becoming Paul's weapon against all who had conspired to destroy his house. The harsh conditions that killed the unprepared had forged the Fremen into an army that conventional forces could not match. The ecology that appeared to be merely backdrop to human concerns was about to reveal itself as the key to unimaginable leverage. The boy who had fled for his life was becoming something else, not a duke like his father, but something unprecedented in the Imperium's 10,000-year history. He was becoming the convergence point of genetic programs, religious conditioning, strategic necessity, and prescient vision. He was becoming Muad'Dib, the one who could see the paths through the storm, who would lead the Fremen from the desert into the galaxy itself. And in his visions, Paul saw the fires of jihad spreading across star systems, his name invoked by warriors who would kill in his name, the terrible consequences of building power on religious fervor and ecological leverage. He saw it all and chose to continue anyway, because the alternatives were worse, because those who had conspired against his father deserved what was coming, because the Fremen deserved better than continued exploitation. The power base was built. The strategy was clear. The moment of striking was approaching. In the deep desert, hidden from imperial observation, Paul Muad'Dib waited with the patience the desert taught, conserving strength, preparing for the right moment, ready to demonstrate what happened when those who controlled the lever understood exactly how much force could be applied and were willing to pull it without restraint. In the natural world, certain species remain dormant for years, invisible to predators and competitors alike, conserving energy until conditions become perfect for emergence. Then, with sudden explosive growth, they transform entire ecosystems. The cicada spends 17 years underground before surfacing in numbers that overwhelm every defense. Paul Muad'Dib and his Fremen had waited in the deep desert, building strength while appearing insignificant. Now the moment had come to emerge, and what followed would overwhelm every calculation the Baron and Emperor had made. The campaign began not with a single dramatic strike, but with systematic destruction targeting the economic foundation of imperial power. Paul understood that defeating the Baron's military forces would accomplish nothing if the Emperor could simply send reinforcements. Instead, he needed to create a crisis that forced imperial response while demonstrating capabilities that conventional military thinking could not counter. The first spice harvester exploded at dawn, its massive machinery consumed by coordinated strikes that came from nowhere and vanished back into case. Sand. The Harkonnen response followed standard protocols: send ornithopters to investigate, dispatch ground forces to secure the area, analyze the attack pattern to prevent recurrence. But when the response force arrived, they found nothing except wreckage and the peculiar marks in sand that indicated sandworms had been in the area. The second harvester fell the next day, then 3 more the day after. The attacks showed sophistication that primitive desert raiders should not possess. The strike teams moved with military precision, targeted vulnerable points in harvester operations, and escaped before air support could arrive. Most disturbing to Harkonnen analysts was the evidence that attackers were deliberately attracting sandworms to harvester locations, using the massive creatures as weapons of terror and destruction. This tactic revealed understanding of planetary ecology that should not exist among scattered tribal populations. Sandworms normally avoided areas with regular spice harvesting operations. The machinery's vibrations and noise kept them at distance. But if someone understood sandworm behavior precisely enough, if they could create rhythmic patterns that attracted rather than repelled these ancient creatures, if they timed their attacks to coincide with sandworm arrival, then the planet's own ecology became a weapon system no conventional military force could counter. The Baron's initial response was to increase security around harvesting operations, to deploy more troops and air support, to establish patrol patterns designed to interdict attackers before they could strike. This response failed completely. The desert was simply too vast, the number of potential targets too numerous, and the attackers' knowledge of terrain too comprehensive. For every harvester protected, 3 others operated beyond immediate support range. The Fremen struck where defenses were weak, vanished before reinforcements arrived, and left destruction that accumulated faster than it could be replaced. Calculate the economic pressure this created. Each destroyed harvester represented not merely the loss of equipment, which was expensive but replaceable, but the loss of spice production from that unit. Arrakis produced perhaps 50 million Solaris of spice annually under normal operations. Every harvester destroyed reduced that production. More critically, the attacks created uncertainty that made planning impossible. Could the Baron guarantee sufficient spice delivery to satisfy guild requirements? Could CHOAM shareholders expect their dividends? Could the Emperor rely on the revenues that funded imperial operations? This uncertainty itself became a weapon. The spice market began to react with price volatility that reflected fears about supply disruption. The Spacing Guild issued concerned inquiries about whether the Baron could maintain production levels. CHOAM directors started asking uncomfortable questions about security measures and contingency planning. The Emperor received reports suggesting that the Arrakis situation might require direct imperial intervention. Paul had created exactly the crisis he needed, one that forced response while demonstrating that conventional military approaches were insufficient. The Baron could send more troops, deploy more equipment, establish more security protocols. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. Fremen forces controlled the deep desert, understood the planetary ecology better than off-worlders could learn, and could sustain operations indefinitely, while Harkonnen forces exhausted themselves chasing enemies who appeared and vanished like desert mirages. The tactical use of sandworms as weapons represented Paul's deepest understanding of how to fight a war using asymmetric advantages. A sandworm could be hundreds of meters long, possessed of such mass and power that it could destroy any ground vehicle, attracted by rhythmic vibrations and driven into feeding frenzy by properly calibrated signals. The Fremen had learned over centuries how to ride sandworms, how to mount them and guide their direction through careful manipulation of their segments. Now Paul was teaching them how to weaponize this knowledge, how to turn their greatest source of danger into their most powerful tactical asset. Imagine a Harkonnen patrol encountering this tactic for the first time. They would see Fremen forces in the distance, perhaps positioned near a spice harvester. Standard response would be to pursue, to engage with superior firepower and numbers. But as the patrol advanced, they would feel the ground begin to vibrate with a rhythm that meant something terrible was approaching. A sandworm would emerge beneath them, attracted by the vibrations the Fremen had carefully created, its mouth large enough to swallow entire vehicles. The patrol would be destroyed in moments, consumed by a creature that conventional weapons could barely harm, killed by the planet itself as much as by human enemies. This was warfare that existed outside imperial military doctrine. The great houses fought through assassins and limited military actions, constrained by conventions that prevented total war. The Sardaukar represented the ultimate expression of human military capability, perfectly trained soldiers equipped with the best technology. But no amount of training prepared them for combat where the planet itself became the enemy, where the ecology served as a weapons system, where survival required knowledge that could only be gained through generations of adaptation. The Baron understood he was facing something unprecedented. His intelligence reports confirmed that these attacks were not random raids but coordinated campaigns directed by unified command. The scattered desert tribes he had dismissed for decades were functioning as a military force with capabilities that matched or exceeded his own troops. Most disturbing was the emerging evidence that someone with sophisticated strategic training was directing operations. The attack patterns showed Mentat-level analysis. The timing suggested prescient knowledge of Harkonnen movements. The overall strategy revealed understanding of imperial politics that primitive desert dwellers should not possess. The Baron began to suspect what his agents eventually confirmed. Paul Atreides lived. The boy he had dismissed as insignificant threat had somehow survived in the deep desert, had somehow built alliances with the Fremen, and was now directing a campaign that threatened everything the Baron had worked 80 years to build. This realization transformed the situation from operational problem to existential crisis. If an Atreides survived and controlled Fremen military capability, then the Baron's restoration to Arrakis power was not merely challenged but potentially doomed. The calculated economic pressure forcing imperial response proceeded according to Paul's strategy. Every destroyed harvester, every missed spice quota, every concerned inquiry from the guild or Chom created pressure on the Emperor to resolve the situation. Shaddam IV could not allow spice production to collapse. The political and economic consequences would be catastrophic. But intervening openly meant acknowledging that the Harkonnen could not maintain control, which would raise uncomfortable questions about why Arrakis had been returned to them after the Atreides disaster. Paul understood this pressure perfectly. He was not trying to defeat the Baron militarily. He was trying to force the Emperor into a position where direct confrontation became unavoidable. Each destroyed harvester was a message to Shaddam. The situation on Arrakis requires your personal attention. Each successful Fremen raid demonstrated that the Baron's control was illusory. Each day of disrupted spice production increased the likelihood that the Emperor would have to respond personally rather than through proxies. The strategic timing Paul employed showed sophistication that would have made his father proud. He did not strike randomly but calibrated his campaign to create maximum political pressure while the Emperor was already dealing with other challenges. He accelerated attacks when guild inquiries increased, creating the impression that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. He leaked information through carefully positioned sources, suggesting that Atreides loyalists were organizing resistance, that the Baron's conspiracy with the Emperor might become public knowledge, that the entire Arrakis situation was approaching crisis that demanded direct Imperial intervention. This information warfare complemented the physical campaign of spice harvester destruction. Paul was not merely fighting a military campaign but orchestrating a comprehensive assault on the political arrangements that had allowed his father's murder. He wanted the Emperor to come to Arrakis personally, to bring his Sardaukar, to commit himself so completely that retreat became impossible. Only then could Paul spring the trap he had been building in the deep desert. The waiting for the Emperor's personal arrival required patience that Paul found increasingly difficult to maintain. His Fremen forces were ready, eager for confrontation, driven by religious fervor that made them see Paul's cause as holy war rather than political maneuvering. The prescient visions showed him futures branching from this moment, some leading to victory, some to catastrophic defeat, all of them depending on precise timing and execution that allowed no margin for error. When word finally came that Emperor Shaddam IV was coming to Arrakis personally, bringing his Sardaukar legions and his daughter Princess Irulan, Paul knew the moment had arrived. The Emperor's presence on Arrakis would provide the stage for final confrontation. The Sardaukar would represent the ultimate test of Fremen military capabilities. The presence of Princess Irulan would provide the political leverage Paul needed to transform military victory into permanent change to imperial power structure. The revelation of atomic weapons represented Paul's most dangerous gambit. The Great Convention absolutely prohibited the use of atomics against human targets. Such use would unite every house in the Landsraad against the violator, would justify immediate extermination by combined Imperial and Guild action. But Paul had discovered a loophole in the Convention's wording. Using atomics against geological formations rather than human targets might technically comply with the letter of the law while achieving strategic objectives. Paul used his family's atomics not to kill, but to destroy a mountain range protecting the Baron's stronghold, opening a pathway for Fremen forces to strike directly at the heart of Harkonnen power. This demonstration served multiple purposes simultaneously. It showed that Paul possessed weapons of mass destruction and was willing to use them creatively. It proved that he understood the legal frameworks governing imperial warfare well enough to exploit their ambiguities. Most critically, it forced the Emperor and his Sardaukar into direct engagement rather than allowing them to remain as observers, while Harkonnen forces attempted to suppress the Fremen rebellion. The brilliant positioning that made spice destruction a credible threat became the centerpiece of Paul's final strategy. He did not merely threaten to destroy spice harvesters which could be rebuilt, he threatened to destroy the spice cycle itself, to disrupt the planetary ecology so completely that Arrakis would cease producing spice for generations, or possibly forever. This threat was not bluff but demonstrated capability, proven through his command of sandworms and understanding of how the spice life cycle functioned. Consider the implications of this threat from the Emperor's perspective. If Paul destroyed the spice cycle, interstellar civilization would collapse within years. The Spacing Guild would lose their ability to navigate. The Bene Gesserit would lose their prescient capabilities. The life-extending properties of spice would become unavailable to the elite throughout the Imperium. Trillions of humans scattered across 1 million worlds would be cut off from each other, isolated, watching their civilization fragment into separate evolutionary paths. This was not merely political leverage, it was existential threat to everything the Imperium had built over 10,000 years. The Emperor could kill Paul, could exterminate every Fremen, could reduce Arrakis to radioactive wasteland, but if Paul made good on his threat before dying, the cost of his death would be the end of human interstellar civilization. No military victory could justify such a price. Paul had achieved what his father attempted but never completed, building a position where his survival became more valuable to the Imperium than his death. The difference was that Duke Leto tried to build this position through competence and legitimacy. Paul built it through demonstrated willingness to destroy everything if his demands were not met. The Duke had been too honorable to threaten civilizational collapse. His son had learned that honor was insufficient weapon against enemies willing to use any means to maintain power. The duel with Feyd-Rautha represented political theater as much as personal combat. By Fremen tradition and imperial convention, leadership could be challenged through personal combat. The Baron had positioned his nephew Feyd-Rautha as his heir, had trained him as the perfected expression of Harkonnen ruthlessness and capability. A duel between Paul and Feyd-Rautha would settle more than personal dominance, it would determine which philosophy of power would prevail, which approach to governance the Imperium would accept. Paul's victory in this duel was never in doubt to those who understood his capabilities. His prescience allowed him to see every possible attack before it came. His training exceeded anything the Baron had provided Feyd-Rautha. His motivation avenging his father, protecting the Fremen, securing the future he had seen in his visions, gave him focus that mere ambition could not match. When Feyd-Rautha died on Paul's blade, it represented not just personal victory, but the symbolic death of the Harkonnen approach to power, the defeat of the system that had conspired against Duke Leto. The forced marriage to Princess Irulan created legal claim to the throne that the Emperor could not easily dismiss. By imperial convention and Landsraad tradition, marriage to the Emperor's daughter conveyed certain rights and status. Paul did not love Irulan, his heart belonged to Chani. But he understood that political marriage served political purposes, that legitimacy required forms as well as force, that transforming from rebel leader to legitimate imperial authority required using every tool the system provided. This marriage also protected Irulan herself. The Emperor's daughter could have been killed when her father fell, could have been dismissed as irrelevant to Paul's purposes. Instead, Paul recognized her value as bridge between old imperial authority and the new order he was creating. Through her, the great houses could accept Paul's ascension without seeing it as complete overthrow of traditional order. Through her, the forms and ceremonies that gave imperial power its legitimacy could continue even as the substance of that power transformed completely. The checkmate position, leaving the Emperor no strategic alternative to surrender, represented the culmination of everything Paul had built in the deep desert. The Emperor faced a young man who commanded military forces that had defeated Sardaukar, who possessed atomic weapons he had proven willing to use, who threatened to destroy the spice cycle if attacked, who had legitimate claim to the throne through marriage to the imperial daughter, and who was backed by religious fervor that would sustain jihad across the galaxy if he were martyred. Every strategic calculation favored surrender. Shaddam could fight and probably kill Paul, but the cost would be the end of interstellar civilization and the unleashing of jihad that would consume the Imperium. He could attempt to maintain his throne, but Paul's legitimacy and military power made this position untenable. He could try to negotiate compromise, but Paul's demands were absolute surrender the throne or watch everything burn. This was the terrible logic Paul had embraced in the deep desert. He had built a position so extreme that moderate outcomes became impossible. Either the Emperor surrendered completely, or Paul would destroy the foundations of imperial power, even if that destruction took his own life. There was no middle ground, no compromise position, no way to partially defeat someone willing to pull down civilization itself rather than accept defeat. The emperor surrendered. Shaddam IV, ruler of the known universe for decades, abdicated in favor of Paul Muad'Dib, the boy he had tried to kill on the night the Atreides fell. The transfer of power was formalized with all appropriate ceremonies, wrapped in traditional forms that made the revolutionary change seem like legitimate succession. Princess Irulan became Paul's wife. The great houses of the Landsraad accepted the new emperor because refusing meant opposing forces they could not defeat. But this victory was not the ending Paul's visions had promised. It was only the beginning of something far more terrible. The Fremen, inspired by their leader's triumph, would not simply return to their seiches satisfied with justice achieved. They were warriors of absolute faith, convinced that their holy war had only just begun, certain that Muad'Dib's victory proved their divine mandate to transform the entire galaxy according to their vision. Paul had unleashed forces he could guide but not control. The jihad he had feared in his visions was beginning, unstoppable now, gathering momentum that would carry it across star systems regardless of his commands or desires. He had won the political war against the Emperor and the Baron. In doing so, he had lost the moral war against his own conscience, had become the instrument of violence he had hoped to avoid, had proven that strategic genius coupled with absolute leverage could reshape the Imperium but could not prevent catastrophic consequences. Standing in the throne room on Arrakis, accepting the surrender of the Emperor, Paul Muad'Dib saw the futures branching before him with terrible clarity. He saw the jihad spreading, saw his name invoked by warriors who would kill billions in his name, saw the green paradise the Fremen dreamed of purchased with blood across countless worlds. He had achieved everything his strategic planning aimed for, and in achieving it, had become something his father would have been horrified to witness. The spice war was over. Paul had won, and in winning, had discovered that victory and righteousness were not the same thing, that strategic genius could achieve its objectives while betraying its deepest values, that sometimes the greatest tragedy was not failure but success, whose costs exceeded any benefit it provided. The Baron was dead, the Emperor was defeated, the throne was secured, and the real catastrophe, the jihad that would consume civilizations, was only beginning. There are moments in natural history when a species reaches a crossroads, adapt or face extinction, evolve or die, transform completely or vanish from the record of life. Humanity, scattered across 1,000,000 worlds after 10,000 years of imperial stability, stood at such a crossroads in the aftermath of Paul Muad'Dib's ascension. What followed was not the triumph of justice over tyranny, but something far more complex and disturbing. The calculated application of terrible methods in service of species survival. The transformation of a reluctant messiah into a tyrant, and ultimately the validation of logic so harsh that it challenged the very meaning of human morality. Paul Atreides had become emperor through strategic brilliance and the willingness to threaten civilizational collapse. But prescience showed him something that troubled him far more than the jihad already spreading in his name. Humanity faced existential threats that went beyond the political maneuvering of great houses, beyond the economic control of spice production, beyond anything the Imperium's 10,000-year stability had prepared civilization to recognize. Consider what Paul saw in his visions, not merely political futures where different factions gained or lost power, but deep times stretching millennia ahead, showing humanity's potential extinction through stagnation. The Imperium, for all its apparent dynamism, had actually achieved a kind of static equilibrium. The same political structures persisted for millennia. The same technologies dominated. The same patterns repeated across generations. This stability, which seemed like strength, was actually the prelude to species death. In evolutionary terms, stagnation equals vulnerability. A species that stops adapting, that achieves perfect adaptation to current conditions, loses the flexibility needed when conditions change. And conditions always change, whether through internal pressure, external threat, or the simple mathematics of time and entropy. Humanity had spread across 1,000,000 worlds, true, but this spreading had stopped. Population growth had stabilized. Technological innovation had plateaued. The human species, after its explosive expansion following the Butlerian Jihad, had achieved equilibrium in a universe that does not permit permanent equilibrium. Paul saw the threat with prescient clarity. If humanity remained concentrated in the known space of the Parsid Imperium, if it continued to depend on a single substance from a single planet, if it maintained the political and technological stasis that characterized the last 10,000 years, then eventually, whether through disease, catastrophe, or the simple accumulation of systemic vulnerabilities, humanity would face extinction. Not immediate, not dramatic, but inevitable across the timescales that prescience could perceive. This recognition created an impossible moral calculation. Paul could see that preventing humanity's extinction required disrupting the very stability that made civilization comfortable. It required forcing humanity to evolve, to adapt, to spread in ways that the current system actively prevented. And the tool available to force this evolution was the jihad already spreading in his name, the religious warfare that was consuming civilizations even as Paul struggled with its moral implications. The calculated jihad as necessary evil represented Paul's attempt to rationalize the catastrophe he had unleashed. The Fremen warriors who swept across star systems in his name were not merely destroying, they were dispersing humanity, forcing adaptation, breaking the stagnant patterns that had characterized imperial civilization. Every world they conquered became a site of evolutionary pressure. Every population they displaced became a seed for new human development. Every tradition they shattered created space for innovation and change. But understanding the strategic logic did not diminish the horror of its execution. Billions died in the jihad. Entire civilizations were destroyed. The cultural diversity that had characterized the Imperium was being replaced by homogeneous, Fremen-influenced cultures that worshipped Muad'Dib as divine figure. Paul could see the terrible arithmetic. The jihad killed billions now to potentially save trillions in the future, destroyed current civilizations to create evolutionary pressure that might ensure humanity's long-term survival. This was strategic thinking extended to its most disturbing conclusion. Paul was not acting to benefit himself. Prescience showed him futures where he lived and futures where he died, and none of them brought him peace. He was not acting to benefit the current generation. The jihad brought suffering to most humans alive during his reign. He was acting to benefit humanity, a species across timescales that dwarfed individual human concerns, making calculations where civilizations became data points and individual lives disappeared into statistical aggregates. The recognition that stagnation meant species death drove Paul to permit atrocities he could have prevented. He could have called off the jihad. His Fremen would have obeyed. Their religious devotion was absolute. But stopping the jihad meant allowing humanity to continue its comfortable slide toward eventual extinction, meant protecting current lives at the cost of future existence, meant choosing the comfort of moral purity over the harsh requirements of species survival. This created a balance that nearly destroyed Paul psychologically. He knew the jihad was evil by any conventional moral measure. He could see the suffering it caused, hear the prayers of the dying, understand the civilizations being erased. Yet he also saw that stopping it would be a different kind of evil, the evil of allowing preventable extinction, of choosing moral comfort over species survival, of prioritizing the present over the deep future. Paul's difficulty with balancing necessary brutality and moral revulsion manifested in ways that made him increasingly isolated. He could not explain his reasoning to anyone except a very few who possessed the capability to think across such timescales. Most people saw only the immediate horror, the death, the destruction, the suffering of the jihad. They could not perceive the statistical survival benefits accruing across millennia, could not calculate probabilities of extinction prevented versus deaths caused, could not think in the cold arithmetic that strategic survival required. Princess Irulan, his political wife, attempted to understand through her historical scholarship. She recorded Paul's reign with the detachment that allowed her to see patterns others missed. But even she struggled to reconcile the man she observed capable of kindness, troubled by the violence done in his name, with the emperor who permitted jihad to continue. Her histories would struggle to explain Paul Muad'Dib to future generations, to make comprehensible a leader who seemed simultaneously humanitarian and monstrous. Chani, his Fremen wife and true love, understood Paul's pain but could not fully grasp the prescient calculations that drove his decisions. She saw the man tormented by visions of futures he could not prevent, heard him cry out in his sleep about deaths not yet occurred, watched him age beyond his years under the weight of knowledge no human was meant to possess. She provided comfort but not solution, love but not absolution, presence but not the impossible reassurance that what he was doing was right. Leto II, Paul's son, would eventually embrace the harsh logic his father had merely accepted. Where Paul was a reluctant tyrant, tormented by the consequences of his necessary actions, Leto would become something colder, a being who could execute 3,000 years of calculated oppression without the weight of conscience that had nearly destroyed his father. This difference between them was not moral but psychological. Paul remained human enough to be horrified by what he did, while Leto would transform himself into something that could do what was necessary without the burden of human emotion. The breeding programs and forced evolution as strategic imperatives represented the extension of Paul's logic into even more disturbing territory. The Bene Gesserit had attempted this for generations, carefully managing bloodlines to produce desired traits, treating humanity as resource to be shaped according to long-term planning. Paul had been the product of such planning, proof that genetic manipulation could produce capabilities beyond normal human limits. Leto II would extend this approach with mechanical precision. His 3,000-year tyranny, the God-Emperor period that future historians would struggle to comprehend, represented humanity treated as evolutionary experiment on the largest possible scale. Leto would shape human genetics, culture, politics, and ecology according to calculations that made Paul's prescient planning seem modest by comparison. Every element of human civilization would be optimized not for current happiness or justice, but for creating the evolutionary pressure and genetic diversity needed for long-term species survival. Imagine the horror of such existence for those living through it. They would experience tyranny so absolute that no freedom existed, oppression so complete that rebellion became impossible, control so comprehensive that individual human agency disappeared almost entirely. And this tyranny would last not for a lifetime or even a century, but for 3,000 years, 150 generations of humanity living under conditions specifically designed to create evolutionary pressure through suffering. Yet Leto's calculations, cold and precise, suggested this was necessary. Humanity needed to hate tyranny so completely that it would never accept such control again. It needed to be forced into such constrained circumstances that when freedom finally came, the explosion of diversity and innovation would scatter humanity so widely across the universe that no single catastrophe could threaten species survival. The scattering as deliberate strategy ensuring human survival through dispersion represented the ultimate goal of this centuries-long calculation. Leto foresaw that his tyranny would eventually end. He designed it to end, and when it did, Humanity would flee his empire in every direction simultaneously. Some would go to the farthest reaches of known space. Others would venture beyond the edges of maps, into regions no navigator had charted. Still others would develop technologies specifically designed to hide from any possible observation or control. This dispersal would make humanity effectively immune to extinction. No disease could reach every scattered population. No war could threaten every separate colony. No catastrophe could affect every isolated group. Humanity would fragment into thousands or millions of separate evolutionary experiments, each one adapting to local conditions, each one developing unique capabilities, each one representing a separate bet on humanity's long-term survival. The cost of this strategy was everything that made civilization valuable in conventional terms. Unity would be lost, common culture would disappear. The ability to coordinate or communicate across the species would become impossible. Humanity would effectively cease to exist as a single entity, fragmenting into countless separate branches that might eventually become separate species. But the species in its dispersed, fragmented, diverse forms would survive. The return of the honored matres, validating the terrible logic of the Golden Path, provided confirmation that came millennia after the strategy's implementation. The honored matres, descendants of humans who had scattered beyond the known universe during and after Leto's reign, returned with capabilities and motivations that confirmed both the success and the necessity of the dispersal strategy. They had survived. In the deepest unknown regions of space, cut off from the old Imperium, forced to adapt to conditions no imperial world had ever faced. They had not merely endured, but had developed capabilities that exceeded anything the original human civilization had achieved. They were violent, yes, and dangerous in ways that made them terrible, threat to the ordered societies they encountered upon return. But they were also proof that the scattering had worked, that humanity could survive and evolve in conditions that would have destroyed any unified civilization. More importantly, the honored matres represented validation of the core assumption underlying the Golden Path, that humanity needed to be dispersed to survive existential threats. In the deep unknown regions where the honored matres had originated, they had encountered something they called it the enemy, and would not or could not describe it fully, that had threatened their extinction. But because they were part of a scattered humanity, this threat had not endangered the species as a whole. The destruction of one branch left countless others untouched. This was exactly what the Golden Path had been designed to achieve. Not preventing threats, which was impossible across the timescales of species survival, but ensuring that no single threat could endanger humanity as whole. The honored matres' survival of their encounter with the enemy proved that Leto's calculations had been correct, that the 3,000 years of tyranny had purchased exactly what they were intended to purchase: species survival through enforced diversity and dispersion. Yet this validation came at costs that challenged any attempt to call the strategy right in moral terms. The honored matres themselves were evidence of this cost. They had survived, but in surviving, had transformed into something that barely resembled the humanity they descended from. They were brutal, manipulative, obsessed with control and domination in ways that made them terrible by any conventional moral measure. Their survival had required abandoning many of the values that made humanity worth preserving. This created the final strategic question that echoed across the millennia. Can species survival justify any method? If humanity survives but loses everything that made it, human compassion, justice, freedom, the capacity for beauty and love, has anything truly been preserved? If the cost of survival is becoming something monstrous, has survival achieved its purpose? Paul Muad'Dib struggled with this question for the years of his reign, tormented by prescient knowledge of what his actions would unleash. He could see that his jihad would kill billions. He could also see that without the dispersal the jihad created, humanity would eventually face extinction. Which choice was more moral? Accepting billions of deaths to potentially save trillions, or preventing those deaths while allowing the species to slide toward eventual extinction? Leto II would answer this question differently than his father. Where Paul remained conflicted, Leto achieved certainty. The God Emperor would execute his 3,000-year plan without doubt or hesitation, would sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, to ensure the species' survival. Leto transformed himself into a sandworm hybrid, extending his life across millennia, making himself into something that could endure the psychological cost of such extended tyranny. He became the monster his strategy required, accepting that preservation of the species justified any personal cost, including the loss of his own humanity. The legacy of viewing humanity as strategic resource requiring maximum preservation flexibility echoed through all subsequent human civilization. After the scattering, after the return of the honored matres, after the God Emperor's reign ended, and humanity began reassembling some form of loose coordination, the fundamental question remained: what costs are acceptable to ensure species survival? Different factions answered differently. The Bene Gesserit continued their breeding programs with methods softened by millennia, but still focused on genetic optimization. The Spacing Guild, transformed by the events surrounding Paul and Leto's reigns, struggled to maintain their role in a universe where humanity had scattered beyond their navigation capabilities. The great houses that survived these transformations adapted by accepting that permanent stability was illusion, that survival required constant adaptation, that the comfortable equilibrium of the old Imperium had been purchased at the cost of evolutionary stagnation. Consider what Paul and Leto's strategy had achieved across the millennia. Humanity had been scattered so widely that no single threat could endanger the species. It had been forced through evolutionary pressures that produced capabilities and adaptations exceeding anything the comfortable imperial civilization had generated. It had learned, through 3,000 years of tyranny, to value freedom so completely that accepting unified control became psychologically impossible. It had proven that the species could survive in conditions ranging from the known universe to the deepest unknown regions where even prescient vision could not penetrate. But this achievement came with costs that no calculation could fully justify. The billions dead in Paul's jihad, the countless generations who lived and died under Leto's oppression, the civilizations erased, the cultural diversity destroyed and then recreated in forms that bore no resemblance to what had been lost. The transformation of humanity from a single species with common heritage into a scattered collection of branches that might eventually become separate species entirely. Were these costs justified? The answer depends on timescale and values. From the perspective of individuals who died in the jihad, who suffered under tyranny, who lost everything they valued, clearly not. From the perspective of species survival across geological timescales, where civilizations rise and fall like seasons, where individual lives become statistics and cultures become evolutionary experiments, perhaps yes. From the perspective of Paul Muad'Dib, who could see both timescales simultaneously and tried to reconcile them, the question had no answer that provided peace. Standing on the edge of the desert at the end of his reign, blinded by a stone burner but still possessed of prescient vision that showed him futures without needing physical sight, Paul Atreides contemplated what he had done and what he had failed to prevent. The jihad burned across the galaxy in his name. His son prepared to become something even more terrible than Paul himself. The golden path stretched ahead, visible in prescient vision, showing millennia of calculated suffering in service of eventual survival. He had achieved his strategic objectives. House Atreides had been avenged. The conspirators who murdered his father had been destroyed. The Fremen had been elevated from exploited population to conquerors of civilizations. The spice that had made Arrakis a prize worth any crime now flowed under Atreides' control, though that control meant little given the transformation of everything else. But these achievements rang hollow against the weight of consequences. Paul had become emperor, but the throne was built on foundations of jihad and maintained through violence he could barely restrain. He had avenged his father, but Duke Leto would have been horrified by the methods employed. He had elevated the Fremen, but in doing so had transformed them from a people of admirable adaptation into weapons of holy war. He had secured humanity's survival, but at costs that made survival itself seem questionable achievement. The terrible knowledge that prescience brought him was that this was the best of all possible outcomes. He had seen other futures ones, where he had died in the desert, where he had refused to lead the jihad, where he had made different choices at crucial moments. In those futures, humanity faced worse outcomes: extinction through stagnation, destruction through more catastrophic wars, or enslavement by forces even more terrible than what the Golden Path required. This was the final cruelty of prescience, knowing not just what would happen but what could have happened, seeing the alternatives and recognizing that the terrible path chosen was still better than the alternatives available. Paul could not claim innocence. He had made choices, had permitted atrocities, had become the instrument of violence his visions had warned him about. But neither could he claim the choices were wrong, because the alternatives were worse. Leto II, preparing to assume the burden his father would eventually abandon, understood something Paul never quite accepted: that the strategic calculation requiring such terrible methods was not a failure of morality, but a deeper truth about existence itself. Survival, whether of individuals, civilizations, or species, requires accepting costs that comfortable philosophy would prefer to deny. The universe does not care about human values. It imposes requirements for survival that exist independent of moral preference. Those who refuse to pay survival's costs do not get credit for maintaining moral purity. They simply cease to exist. The God Emperor would embrace this truth completely, would become the living embodiment of strategic calculation applied without restraint, would execute 3,000 years of tyranny with full knowledge of its costs and full certainty of its necessity. Where Paul was tragic figure knowing what needed to be done but tormented by doing it, Leto would be something more disturbing, a being who knew what needed to be done and did it without the burden of tragedy, without the weight of human conscience, with mechanical precision that made morality irrelevant. This transformation from Paul to Leto represented humanity's confrontation with the deepest questions of existence. Can species survival justify any method? Should it? Is existence itself the highest value? Or do the conditions of existence matter as much as the fact of continuing? These questions have no answers that satisfy both logic and emotion, no resolutions that preserve both species and the values that make species worth preserving. Paul Muad'Dib, the boy who fled into the desert, the young man who built a revolution, the emperor who unleashed jihad, the prescient being who saw too much and understood too well, remained trapped between these irreconcilable truths. He had done what strategic calculation required. He had achieved what his prescience showed was necessary. He had paid the costs survival demanded and imposed far greater costs on billions who never chose to pay them. And in the deep desert, where sandworms moved beneath the surface as they had for millennia, where the spice cycle continued its ancient patterns, where the ecology that had forged Fremen and transformed Paul remained indifferent to human concerns in that eternal desert. The question remained unanswered. Was the Golden Path right, or merely necessary? Did humanity owe its survival to the harsh calculations of Paul and Leto, or did it survive despite them? the answer perhaps matters less than the recognition that the question exists, that survival sometimes requires methods that challenge every value we hold, that strategic genius can achieve its objectives while destroying its soul. Paul Muad'Dib discovered this truth in the harshest way possible, by living it, by becoming the instrument of what he recognized as necessary evil, by achieving everything strategic brilliance could accomplish, while losing everything that made achievement meaningful. The Imperium was transformed. Humanity was scattered. The species would survive. And Paul Atreides stood at the center of it all, blind but still seeing, powerful but helpless before the momentum of forces he had unleashed, celebrated as savior while knowing himself to be architect of catastrophe, living proof that the greatest tragedy is not failure but success, whose costs exceed any benefit. Strategic genius in service of necessity that transcends morality. In the end, the golden path stretched ahead, visible to prescient vision, showing humanity's survival purchased at prices no individual could choose to pay, but which the species as whole would bear. Whether this represented triumph or tragedy, wisdom or madness, salvation or damnation, these questions would echo through millennia, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, testament to the terrible complexity of choosing between extinction and existence, between comfortable death and harsh survival, between morality and necessity. The desert teaches this final lesson. Survival requires accepting harsh truths, paying terrible costs, becoming what must be become, regardless of preference. Paul Muad'Dib learned this lesson completely. In learning it, he ensured humanity's survival while sacrificing his own humanity. The question that haunts his legacy and ours is whether any alternative was possible, whether species survival could have been purchased at lower cost, or whether the universe simply imposes its terms and requires acceptance regardless of the price demanded. This is the story of Arrakis, of Paul Muad'Dib, of the golden path that stretched across millennia. It is a story without comfortable resolution, without clear heroes or villains, without the satisfaction of knowing that choices were right rather than merely necessary. It is humanity's confrontation with its own survival, with the costs of existence, with the terrible recognition that sometimes the price of tomorrow is the sacrifice of everything that makes today worth living. And the spice still flows, and the sandworms still move, and the desert remains indifferent to human concerns, eternal in its harsh demands, beautiful in its terrible truths about survival and sacrifice, power and price, strategy and soul.